They threw him out in front of his 9-year-old daughter, security guards, marble floors, every eye in that gilded lobby watching. The woman in the designer dress didn't even look back. She just said, "Remove them," and kept walking. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that the man she'd just humiliated in front of his crying child had more right to stand in that hotel than she ever would. His father built it, and it had been stolen from his family before Landon Pierce was old enough to understand what theft even looked like. Like this video, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. Let's see how far this story travels. The morning started in the way most of Landon Pierce's mornings did, in pieces. The alarm went off at 6:15, and he was already awake, lying on his back in the dark, running through the math in his head the way he always did before his feet hit the floor. The overtime shift he'd picked up Tuesday had covered most of Chloe's school supply list. The side job he'd taken repainting a storage unit facility 2 weekends ago had squared the electric bill. The money he'd put aside in the old coffee tin on the second shelf of the kitchen cabinet, the one Chloe called the secret fund, even though she knew exactly what it was and exactly what it was for, had finally reached $230. $230. It had taken 4 months. He lay there a moment longer, listening to the apartment. The radiator clicked and hissed. A car rolled through the street below, bass rattling softly from its speakers. Then from down the hall, the sound of small feet hitting the floor. Chloe. She was up before her own alarm, which meant she'd remembered. Landon sat up, rubbed his face with both hands, and got moving. The Royal Crest Hotel's children's art exhibition had been running for 2 years. It was one of those events that floated through the city's social pages and weekend supplements, always accompanied by photographs of mothers in cashmere and fathers in clean linen, their children posed beside colorful canvases in airy, light-filled rooms. Admission was $35 per adult, $15 for children under 12. Free on Saturday mornings for community guests, according to the small print on the hotel's website. A detail Landon had read 4 times to make sure he wasn't misunderstanding it. He hadn't misunderstood it. Still, he'd ironed his best shirt the night before. He'd made Chloe lay out her clothes, the green dress with the white collar that she'd worn to her 3rd grade spring recital and still fit, barely. He'd polished his shoes with a rag and a small tin of polish he found under the bathroom sink, which might have been 5 years old but still worked. He wasn't sure why he felt the need to do all of it. He just did. Chloe had her small backpack with her sketchbook inside. She drew constantly, on the backs of receipts, on paper grocery bags, on the margins of her homework, until her teacher started sending notes home. She wanted to be an artist. At 9 years old, she said it with the kind of absolute certainty that Landon hadn't felt about anything in years, and he tried to protect that certainty the way you protect something fragile in your coat pocket. The exhibition was the reason she'd asked for the secret fund in the first place. "Dad, can we go see the real paintings? The ones at the fancy hotel?" And he'd said yes, even before he'd figured out how. The Royal Crest Hotel sat at the north end of Caldwell Avenue, like something that had been placed there to remind everyone what money looked like when it had been around long enough to develop opinions. It was 12 stories of pale limestone and dark glass, with a canopied entrance flanked by doormen in pressed gray coats, potted trees trimmed into perfect cylinders, and a revolving door that moved with the smooth, silent certainty of something that had never once stuck or squeaked in its life. Landon had driven past it 100 times. He'd never been inside. He parked 2 blocks away because the valet situation at the entrance made him uncomfortable in a way he didn't feel like examining too closely. The car was a 2009 Civic with a cracked rear bumper and a side mirror held on with electrical tape. It ran fine. He was proud of it for running fine, but he wasn't going to pull it up to those doors. "How far is it?" Chloe asked, falling into step beside him. 2 blocks? That's not far." "No." She looked up at him. "Are you nervous?" "Why would I be nervous?" "You're walking fast." He slowed down. "Better?" She considered it. A little. The morning was cool and bright, the kind of early October day that couldn't decide whether it wanted to be summer or fall, and had settled on something in between. Chloe had her backpack on both shoulders and her hair in two braids that Landon had done himself, which was a skill he'd spent the better part of 3 years developing through YouTube tutorials and a lot of patient suffering on Chloe's part. "Tell me what you want to see first," he said. She'd done her research. "There's a watercolor series by this woman named Adara something. She does these really big nature scenes, but they're not realistic. They're more like emotional. And there's a sculpture installation on the second floor that uses light, like the light is actually part of the sculpture." She paused. "I looked it up. I know what I want." "I know you do. I have a list." "Of course you do." She reached into her backpack without breaking stride and pulled out a folded piece of paper covered in her small, dense handwriting. He glanced at it. There were 8 items on it, numbered, with little asterisks next to 3 of them. "What are the asterisks?" "Those are the ones I really don't want to miss in case we run out of time." He laughed. He couldn't help it. "We're not going to run out of time, Chloe." She refolded the paper and put it back. "You said that at the Science Museum, and we missed the whole geology wing." "That was different." "How?" He didn't have a good answer for that. "We won't miss anything today." She seemed to accept this. They walked the rest of the block in comfortable silence, and then the Royal Crest Hotel came into view at the end of the street, enormous and pale and shining in the morning light, and Landon watched his daughter's face change when she saw it. Her mouth opened slightly. She stopped walking for half a second. Then she started again, faster this time. The lobby of the Royal Crest Hotel was exactly what you'd expect from the outside, which was the point. Everything was deliberate. The ceilings were high enough to make you reconsider your posture. The floors were a pale, veined marble that reflected the light from the chandeliers above in shifting geometric patterns. There was a floral arrangement in the center of the lobby that was taller than Landon and made from flowers he couldn't name, and the whole space had a particular smell, something expensive and clean and faintly floral. That wasn't a natural smell but had been engineered to feel like one. The people moving through it were dressed accordingly. There were women in structured coats with handbags on their arms, men in blazers, some with open collars, some with ties, children in their best clothes, walking close to their parents with that specific stiffness children get when they've been told to behave. Landon kept his hand loosely on Chloe's shoulder as they moved toward the information desk. He was aware of himself in a way he usually wasn't. Aware of his shirt, which was clean and pressed, but was also just a shirt. Aware of his shoes, which were polished but also worn at the heels. Aware of the fact that he was carrying a canvas tote bag instead of a briefcase or nothing at all. He told himself to stop it. They reached the information desk. A young woman in a blazer the color of old bronze looked up at them. "Good morning," Landon said. "We're here for the children's art exhibition. The Saturday Community Access." Of course. She was already pulling something up on her screen. "Names?" "Pierce, Landon, and Chloe," she typed. A brief pause. "Here you are. You're all set." She handed him a small printed card with a stylized crown logo and the exhibition name in clean serif type. "The exhibition is on the second floor. Elevators are to your right, or you can take the main staircase straight ahead. The children's wing opens at 10, and you're about 15 minutes early, so feel free to explore the lobby level. There's complimentary refreshments set up just past the east corridor." "Thank you," he said. She smiled, genuine, uncomplicated. "Enjoy your visit." Chloe was already pulling lightly on his sleeve. He let her lead him toward the staircase because she'd already spotted it, a wide, sweeping curve of pale stone with a brass handrail that she immediately put her hand on and ran her fingers along as they climbed. "It's warm," she said, surprised. "Brass does that." She kept her hand on it all the way up. Landon saw the woman from across the lobby, approximately 9 minutes after they arrived, though he didn't know who she was yet. He registered her the way you register something that moves differently than everything else in the room. Most people in the lobby were navigating it, guests finding their bearings, staff moving purposefully between points. This woman moved through it like she owned the floor plan, like the marble under her feet was there because she'd decided it should be. She was in her late 20s, he guessed, though there was something in her bearing that made her seem both younger and older at the same time. Dark hair pulled back smoothly, a charcoal blazer over a silk blouse. heels that clicked with a kind of metronomic authority on the marble floor. She was talking to a man in a hotel uniform while simultaneously reading from a tablet, and the man was nodding with the particular posture of someone trying to look confident while also being slightly afraid of the answer to whatever question had just been asked. Landon filed her away as someone important and turned back to Chloe, who had stopped at the East Corridor entrance and was peering around the corner toward the complimentary refreshments. "Can I get a juice?" "Yeah, go ahead." She disappeared around the corner. Landon stayed just outside, leaning against the corridor entrance, scrolling briefly through his phone, not because there was anything important on it, just the habit. He texted his neighbor, Mrs. Adeyemi, when they left that morning because she sometimes watched Chloe on Saturdays and he wanted her to know they were out. And Mrs. Adeyemi had responded with a string of emojis that he'd interpreted as enthusiastic and supportive. He heard the small crash before he fully registered what it was. A short, sharp sound, the kind a glass makes when it hits marble from low height. Not a shattering explosion, more of a hard, decisive clap followed by the spreading silence of broken things. He was already moving when he heard Chloe's voice. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean—" He came around the corner into the East Corridor and saw her immediately. She was standing beside a small side table that had been set near the wall with a tray of complimentary refreshments on it, glasses of orange juice and water, a small plate of pastries, a squat glass vase with 3 white flowers. The vase was on the floor in pieces. The water from it had spread across the marble in a flat, spreading circle. One of the flowers had landed near Chloe's shoe. Her hands were pressed together in front of her, and her face had that specific expression, the one he knew, where she was working very hard not to cry. "I was just reaching for the juice and my elbow," she started. "It's okay," he said. "Are you hurt?" "No." "You sure?" "I didn't cut myself." She looked at the broken glass. "I'm really sorry. These things happen." He crouched to start picking up the larger pieces. "Don't touch the glass, Chloe. Let me—" "Excuse me." The voice came from directly behind him, and it was a voice built for rooms that fell quiet when it spoke. He looked up. The woman in the charcoal blazer was standing at the corridor entrance. She wasn't looking at Chloe. She was looking at him. Her expression was the kind of careful neutral that is actually a judgment that has already been rendered. "I'll need you to step away from that." Landon stood up. He had 2 pieces of broken glass in his hand. "My daughter knocked it over accidentally. I was just going to—" "Our staff will handle it." She looked at the mess on the floor and then back at him, and it was the second look that told him everything. It wasn't the look you give someone who's made an innocent mistake. It was slower than that. It moved across him the way an assessor moves through a room that isn't expected to offer much. "I understand," he said. He put the glass pieces carefully on the edge of the tray. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience. We'll step out." "I think that would be best." She wasn't raising her voice. She didn't need to. In fact, she turned slightly and made a small gesture, and Landon became aware of 2 men in hotel security uniforms who had materialized at the corridor entrance behind her, the way these things always seem to happen in places like this, as though they'd been waiting just off stage. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises." The corridor wasn't empty. 3 other guests were there, a couple with a young boy, a woman on her phone, and they had all stopped to watch in the particular way that people watch something uncomfortable in a public space, pretending they aren't watching. Landon kept his voice even. "We have passes. We're here for the community access exhibition." "I'm aware of the program," she said. "But given the damage, it was an accident." He wasn't angry yet. He was working at not being angry yet. "She's 9. She bumped a table. That's all that happened." The woman's expression didn't change. "I understand, but this is a managed property, and we reserve the right—" "You reserve the right," he repeated quietly. "Yes." He looked at her. She held it. There was nothing uncertain in her face, and no second-guessing, no moment of reconsidering. She'd made a calculation when she walked into this corridor, and the calculation had been completed before she spoke her first word. He understood, standing there with his daughter's eyes on him, and 3 strangers watching, that there was no version of this conversation that ended with him winning an argument. Not here. Not like this. He turned to Chloe. She was looking up at him with an expression that broke something small and quiet in his chest. She wasn't crying. She was past the point of crying. She was in that place children sometimes reach where the hurt is too large and too confusing for tears to contain it, so instead it just sits in their face, open and undefended. "Come on, sweetheart," he said. "Dad, it's okay." He held out his hand. "Come on." She took his hand. Her fingers were small and cold, and she held on harder than usual. One of the security guards stepped slightly to the side to make space for them to pass, which was somehow worse than if he'd just stood there. The gesture carried the particular indignity of being guided out, of being escorted like someone who couldn't be trusted to find the door themselves. Landon walked out through the corridor and across the lobby. He didn't look at the information desk woman, who had been so warm and genuine 20 minutes ago. He didn't look at the other guests. He looked straight ahead at the revolving door, and he walked his daughter through it. The doorman on the outside held it without expression. The morning air hit them like something resetting. Chloe held his hand all the way down the steps to the sidewalk, and then she stopped. "Why did she do that?" she asked. He stopped too. He looked down at her. "Because she made a judgment." "About what?" He watched a cab pass in the street. He thought about the iron in his shirt and the polish on his shoes and the 2 blocks he'd walked from his parked car. He thought about the coffee tin on the second shelf of the kitchen cabinet and the 4 months it had taken to reach $230. "About us," he said. Chloe was quiet for a moment. "Is that because we're not rich?" "That's part of it." "Do poor people deserve less respect?" He looked at her. 9 years old, 2 braids, 1 flower from the vase still somehow caught on the toe of her shoe without her noticing. "No," he said. "They don't. Nobody does." She looked back at the hotel, then at him. Then why did she treat us like that? He didn't have a clean answer for that one. He had honest answers and complicated answers, and answers that were true but would require explanations he wasn't sure how to give a 9-year-old on a sidewalk on a Saturday morning after she'd just been walked out of a building she'd spent 4 months saving up to visit. So instead he said, "I don't know yet." He reached down and picked the flower petal off her shoe. He held it between his fingers for a second, small, white, already wilting, and then he tucked it into the front pocket of her backpack. "We should go home," he said. She nodded. She didn't let go of his hand. They didn't talk much on the drive back. Chloe sat in the passenger seat with her sketchbook open on her lap, but she wasn't drawing. She was just resting her hand on the open page, looking out the window at the city moving past. Landon drove and let her have the silence. He was good at silence. He'd been good at it since the year Chloe was 4 and Rachel died in a car accident on a Tuesday afternoon in March, 40 minutes after dropping Chloe at preschool. He'd had to learn a lot of things that year. How to do hair, how to make appointments, how to explain to a small child that some absences are permanent. And one of the things he'd learned was that silence wasn't always something that needed to be filled. Sometimes it was just the shape of what couldn't be said yet. But this silence had a different texture than the ones he was used to. This one had the woman's voice in it. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises." The security guards appearing like they'd been waiting. The corridor full of strangers pretending not to watch his daughter's face. He turned onto their street and pulled up in front of the apartment building. Chloe hadn't moved. "Chloe, I was thinking," she said. "About what?" "About whether that's the first time something like that happened to you." He put the car in park. He looked at the building entrance for a moment. "Why?" "Because you didn't look surprised." He turned to her. She was still looking out the window, her hand still on the blank page of her sketchbook. "I've had experiences like that before," he said carefully. "What kind of experiences?" "Where someone decided something about me before they knew anything about me." "Because of money?" "That's part of it." She finally looked at him. "That's not fair." "No, it isn't." She held his gaze, and he saw in her face the thing he loved most about her, and also the thing that made him most afraid for her, the absolute, uncompromising clarity with which she held on to the idea that the world should behave according to the logic of fairness. She'd gotten that from her mother. Rachel had been the same way, a particular kind of refusal to rationalize. "Okay," Chloe said. She picked up her sketchbook, tucked it under her arm, and opened her door. The apartment was 3 rooms and a small balcony that was too narrow to put a chair on, but good for standing. Landon had lived there for 6 years since the year Chloe started preschool, and he'd had to pick a place that was close to the school district and affordable on what he was making at the time, which was not a lot. He told himself it was temporary. He'd been saying that for 6 years. The kitchen was small but organized. The living room doubled as Chloe's art space. There was a table in the corner covered in her materials, a corkboard on the wall where she pinned things she was working on or thinking about. Her room was at the end of the hall, his was next to it, and between them was the bathroom with the leaky faucet that the building manager had been planning to fix for about 3 years. Chloe went to her room when they got home. She didn't slam the door. She never slammed doors, but she closed it with a particular quietness that he recognized as her needing space to process. He went to the kitchen and put water on for coffee. While the kettle heated, he stood at the counter and tried to figure out what was wrong with him. Not the humiliation. He'd had worse. He'd had moments in his life that made this morning look like a mild inconvenience. What he was trying to locate was something specific, a rawness, a particular ache that didn't belong to the morning alone. He made his coffee and took it to the small table in the living room. He sat. The corkboard was full of Chloe's work. In the center was a drawing she'd done about 6 months ago, a building that was obviously meant to be the Royal Crest Hotel, recognizable by the little crown she'd drawn on the facade. She'd been planning this trip since before she'd even asked him about it. The drawing was her version of wanting something. That was how she prepared for things she cared about. She drew them first. He looked at the drawing for a long time. Then he got up and went to the hall closet. The box was on the top shelf behind his winter coat and a pair of boots he'd bought with the intention of hiking and had not used for hiking. It was a standard banker's box, the lid held on with packing tape that had yellowed and begun to lose its adhesion at the edges. His name was written on the side in his father's handwriting. Landon, in the same block letters Robert Pierce had used for everything, every label, every note, every grocery list. He'd moved it 4 times in 6 years. He'd never opened it. He set it on the living room table and looked at it for a moment. Then he peeled back the tape and lifted the lid. The contents were mostly what he'd expected. Manila folders, loose documents, a few photographs, an old leather-bound address book that had belonged to his father. The top folder was labeled in his father's handwriting, Royal Crest Corp. Personal. He sat down and opened it. Robert Pierce had built the Royal Crest Hotel when Landon was 3 years old. Not from nothing. He'd had help, investors, a bank loan that had taken years to negotiate. But the vision had been his. The site acquisition had been his. The design specifications and the construction oversight and the first decade of management had all been his. He'd named it the Royal Crest because of a book he'd loved as a kid, something about a castle, and he'd kept the name even when people told him it sounded pretentious because Robert Pierce had a stubborn streak about the things he cared about. Landon had grown up knowing vaguely that his father had built the hotel, but the way you know things that happened before your conscious memory, as abstract facts, not felt history. By the time he was old enough to have a full conversation with his father about it, Robert Pierce was 48 and dying of pancreatic cancer, and the hotel was long gone. He'd lost it when Landon was 11. Landon remembered the period without being able to reconstruct the specifics. The year his father stopped going to work, the arguments he'd overheard in the kitchen, the way his mother's face had changed. He remembered the move from their house to a smaller apartment. He remembered his father sitting in a chair by the window for long stretches that felt permanent. Robert Pierce had told Landon that he'd lost the hotel in a business dispute. He'd used the word dispute. He hadn't gone into detail. He'd been the kind of man who didn't want his children carrying the weight of his failures. What was in the box was not the record of a failure. What was in the box was the record of a theft. Landon spent 4 hours at the table. He read slowly, carefully, with the focused attention of someone who knows he doesn't have the luxury of misunderstanding. He was not a lawyer. He was not a businessman. He was a man who'd spent his adult life working maintenance jobs and picking up side work and reading every lease and every bill and every fine print disclosure with the careful, suspicious attention of someone who had learned that documents matter and that not reading them carefully was a luxury he couldn't afford. What he found, over the course of those 4 hours, was a detailed and coherent account of how Robert Pierce had been maneuvered out of ownership of the Royal Crest Hotel through a coordinated scheme of fraudulent debt instruments, Forged signatures on documentation that had transferred voting shares to parties his father had never agreed to transfer them to, and a series of board actions that had been conducted with quorum that was later established to have been falsified. His father had known. The folders were full of his notes, careful, methodical, written in the same block letters as the box label. He'd traced it. He'd documented it. He'd consulted with an attorney, according to a letter in the folder, who had told him the case was strong but would take years and require resources Robert Pierce no longer had. And then his father had gotten sick, and the papers had gone into a box, and the box had gone into a closet, and then into a new closet, and then another. While Landon worked and paid rent and raised Chloe, and did not look at the thing on the top shelf because looking at it required believing that the past was still in motion, and he had not been ready to believe that. Until today. He sat back from the table and looked at the ceiling. He thought about the woman in the charcoal blazer. I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises. The flat certainty of it. The way she hadn't needed to explain herself because the explanation was implicit. You are not the kind of people who belong here. He thought about Chloe asking, do poor people deserve less respect on the sidewalk in front of a hotel his father had built? He thought about the drawing on the corkboard, the little crown on the facade. He got up, went to the kitchen, poured the cold remains of his coffee down the drain, and stood at the sink for a moment with both hands on the counter. Then he went to Chloe's room and knocked. Yeah, she said. He opened the door. She was on her bed with her sketchbook, drawing now. Something with a lot of lines, architectural. He could see from the door. She looked up. I need to make some calls tomorrow, he said. I need you to be patient with me for a little while. She studied him. 9 years old, and she could read him better than most adults he knew. What kind of calls? The kind that matter. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked back at her sketchbook. Okay, she said. He stayed in the doorway a second longer. Hey, Chloe. Yeah? You're going to see that exhibition. She didn't look up, but he saw the small, careful thing that happened at the corner of her mouth. I know, she said. Man, he made his first call at 9 that night to a man named Gerald Osei, who had been a paralegal for 20 years before an injury had ended that career, and who was now Landon's neighbor in apartment 4B and who had, on 3 separate occasions over the past 4 years, looked at documents for Landon in exchange for help with his car. Gerald answered on the second ring. It's late, Gerald said. I know. I need you to look at something. A pause. How big is the something? A box? How big is the box? Standard banker's size. About 4 inches of documents. Another pause. Is this going to be one of those things where I look at it and then I can't stop thinking about it? Probably, Landon said. Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then, come over. They sat at Gerald's kitchen table until past midnight. Gerald read with the same careful attention he'd always brought to documents, slowly, going back, making notes in the margins of a legal pad. He asked questions when he had them. Landon answered when he could. At 12:15, Gerald put down the last folder and took off his reading glasses and sat back in his chair. You understand what this is? Gerald said. It wasn't a question. I think so. This is not a dispute. Your father used the word dispute. This is a fraud. This is a documented, traceable fraud. I know. And you've had this box for 6 years. Before that, it was my father's. Gerald tapped the table with one finger. You're going to need someone who specializes in corporate fraud litigation, not a general practice attorney. Someone who does this specifically. I know. That's not cheap. I know that too. Gerald looked at him. How serious are you about this? Landon thought about the marble lobby, the sound of the security guards positioning themselves behind him, the expression on his daughter's face that had gone past tears into something quieter and harder. I've never been more serious about anything, he said. Gerald nodded slowly. He picked up his pen and the legal pad and started writing a name. Landon drove home at 12:45. He parked the Civic in its usual spot, 2 streets over. He sat in the car for a moment after he turned the engine off, in the quiet of the late city. The thing about carrying something for a long time, he thought, was that you stopped noticing the weight. It became part of how you stood, how you moved through rooms, what your body had decided was normal. You forgot that other people weren't carrying the same thing. You forgot that there was a version of yourself that had existed before you picked it up. He got out of the car and walked home through the cool October night. In the apartment, Chloe's light was off. He checked through the cracked door. She was asleep, her sketchbook still on the bed beside her, her pencil on the floor. He picked up the pencil and set it on her nightstand. He looked at the sketchbook, just the edge of it, the page she'd been working on. He could see the lines from the doorway. Angular, architectural. A building with a small crown drawn at the top. He stood there a moment, then he pulled her door gently closed and went to his room. He didn't sleep for a long time, but when he finally did, it was the sleep of a man who had just decided something. Gerald Osei gave him a name on a Tuesday. The name was Miriam Cho, and Gerald had written it on the bottom of his legal pad the night they'd sat at his kitchen table, going through the box until past midnight. Underneath the name, he'd written 2 words, corporate fraud. Underneath that, a phone number with a downtown area code. "She's expensive," Gerald had said, folding the page and handing it across the table. "But she's the kind of expensive that's worth it if what you've got is real. And what you've got looks real." Landon had put the paper in his wallet. He'd carried it there for 2 days before he called. He made the call on Wednesday morning from the parking lot of the hardware store where he worked, sitting in the Civic on his lunch break with the engine running because the heat had dropped overnight and the car took a while to warm up properly. He ate half a sandwich while the phone rang. He wasn't sure why he'd waited 2 days. Maybe he needed to believe it was still possible before he gave someone else the chance to tell him it wasn't. Miriam Cho answered her own phone, which surprised him. He'd expected a receptionist, a hold, the particular acoustic of a nice office. Instead, he got a direct voice, unhurried, with the specific quality of someone who had heard a lot of things and was waiting to hear whether this would be interesting. He told her what he had. He was brief. He'd rehearsed being brief because Gerald had told him lawyers charge by the minute, and some of them start counting from the first word. He described the box, the documents, the nature of the fraud as Gerald had characterized it. He mentioned the Royal Crest Hotel by name. There was a pause on the other end. "The Royal Crest on Caldwell," Miriam Cho said. "Yes." Another pause, shorter. "How old are the documents?" "The fraud occurred approximately 21 years ago. My father started building his case about 18 years ago. He became ill before he could act on it. And you've had this documentation in your possession for 6 years. Before that, my father had it. Mr. Pierce." Her tone hadn't changed exactly, but something had shifted in it. Not warmer, more focused. "I'm going to need to see everything in that box before I can tell you anything useful. Can you come in?" He came in on Thursday. Yeah. Miriam Cho's office was on the 14th floor of a building on Merchant Street that had a lobby with a security desk and a directory on the wall. Her name was on the directory. Cho and Associates, Corporate Litigation, Suite 1408. The office itself was not the kind of office that was decorated to impress you. It was functional. Bookshelves of case books, a long conference table, stacked files, 2 windows that looked out at the side of another building. Miriam Cho was 43, compact, with sharp eyes behind rectangular glasses and the kind of economy of movement that suggested she didn't waste energy on things that didn't require it. She went through the box the way a doctor goes through a chart, thoroughly, without drama, asking specific questions in a specific order. Her associate, a young man named Patrick, who barely looked up from his own notepad, sat at the corner of the table and wrote things down. They spent 3 hours on it. At the end of the 3 hours, Miriam Cho took off her glasses and set them on the table and looked at Landon directly. "Here's what I can tell you," she said. "The documentation is substantial. It's not complete. There are gaps where additional evidence would strengthen the case, but what your father assembled is significantly more than I usually see at this stage of a potential claim. He was thorough. He was an organized man. The core fraud is identifiable. Fraudulent debt instruments used to manufacture a loan default that wasn't genuine. Forged transfer signatures on share documentation. A board quorum that was falsified to authorize actions your father never consented to." She picked up her glasses again, turned them in her hands. "The question of statute of limitations is complicated but not necessarily disqualifying. There's case precedent for tolling in fraud cases where the injured party was actively deceived about the nature of the loss. Your father documented his own discovery process. When he found things, what he found, that helps. Landon kept his hands flat on the table. What are the realistic outcomes? If we can supplement what you have with financial record subpoenas and deposition testimony, the realistic outcome is restoration of ownership interest. The hotel has changed hands, been refinanced, restructured. I'll need to trace the current ownership chain, which takes time, but the fundamental claim, that your family's ownership was taken through fraud, is documentable from what I'm looking at right now. He was quiet for a moment. What does this cost? She told him. It was a number that made the room feel briefly smaller. He didn't flinch. He'd prepared himself for a large number. Retainer up front? A portion. We can discuss a structure. She looked at him. Mr. Pierce, I want to ask you something directly. Go ahead. What happened that made you open this box now, after 6 years? He thought about Chloe's face in the corridor, the expression that had gone past the point of tears. My daughter asked me a question I didn't have a good answer to, he said. Miriam Cho studied him for a moment. Then she put her glasses back on. Patrick, she said, start a file. The weeks that followed were not dramatic in the way Landon had half expected. They were grinding. They were paperwork and phone calls, and evenings spent at the kitchen table with printed documents and a highlighter, trying to follow the trail Miriam's team was assembling. He took on extra shifts at the hardware store. He picked up 2 weekends of side work, a fence repair job in the suburbs, a garage cleanout, and moved the money directly into the account he'd opened for legal fees. He told himself he was fine with the pace. He wasn't always fine with it. Some nights the impatience sat on him like a physical weight. Chloe knew something was happening without knowing exactly what. She was perceptive in the way of children who've grown up in close quarters with a parent managing things alone. She could read the room by the quality of her father's silences, by whether he ate dinner standing at the counter or sitting at the table, by the particular way he looked at his phone when something came through. One night, she sat across from him while he was reviewing a document Miriam's associate had emailed, and she watched him for long enough that he finally looked up. What? You're doing something, she said. I'm always doing something. Something different. She had a pencil in her hand, turning it end over end. Is it about the hotel? He looked at her. Why would you think it's about the hotel? Because of the way you looked when we left. You didn't look embarrassed. You looked like you were deciding something. He set the document face down on the table. He thought about how much to tell her. She was 9. But she was also Chloe, and there was a particular dishonesty in talking down to her that she'd always been able to detect. My father built that hotel, he said. She went still. What? Your grandfather, Robert Pierce, and he built the Royal Crest Hotel. Before I was old enough to remember it, it was his. She stared at him. What happened to it? Someone took it from him, through lies, through forged documents, through manipulating the business structure until he lost control of it. He knew what happened, but he didn't have the resources to fight it. And then he got sick. He paused. He left behind all his notes, all his research. I found it in a box. Chloe had stopped turning the pencil. She was sitting very still. So, when we went there, she said slowly, yes. And that woman, she had no idea who we were. Chloe looked at the window. Outside, the street was dark, and the streetlight on the corner was putting a yellow rectangle on the ceiling that shifted whenever a car went past. So we had more right to be there than she did, Chloe said. That's what I'm working on proving. She looked at him. Something had moved through her expression, through the stillness. Something he recognized as the particular feeling of a thing clicking into place that you didn't know was unresolved. Is it going to work? She asked. I don't know yet. But you think it might? I think it might. She was quiet again for a moment. Then she picked up her pencil and went back to her sketchbook, and he understood from the quality of her silence that she was processing, that she would come back with more questions when she was ready. He turned the document back over and kept reading. Miriam Cho called him on a Thursday evening, 5 weeks after their first meeting, and her voice had a different quality in it, still controlled, but with something compressed underneath it, the tone of a person holding something in careful hands. I need you to come in tomorrow morning, she said. Early, 8 o'clock if you can. What did you find? A lot. A brief pause. Landon, the ownership chain is traceable and it's documented, and there is a current majority shareholder who can be named in the suit, but there's something else. Another pause, shorter. The current CEO of the Royal Crest Hotel is Victoria Hale. He was standing in the kitchen. He stood there for a moment after she said the name, holding the phone. How long has she been CEO? He said. 7 years. She was brought in by the current ownership group to restructure management. Miriam's voice was careful. She is not implicated in the original fraud. That happened before she was involved, but she is the face of the current operation. He looked at the corkboard in the living room, Chloe's drawing of the hotel with the little crown at the top. I'll be there at 8, he said. He didn't sleep well that night. He lay awake for an hour running through it, the lobby, the corridor, the woman's voice saying remove them with the casual authority of someone who had never been questioned. The way she'd looked at him, the calculation in it. She hadn't known. He told himself that. She'd had no idea who he was, no knowledge of Robert Pierce, or the box in the closet, or the 21-year-old fraud that had put her in that position in the first place. To her, he'd been a stranger in an iron shirt who'd let his kid knock over a vase and argued about it when asked to leave. He understood this. Intellectually, clearly, he understood it. But at 1 a.m, in the dark of his apartment, understanding it and feeling easy about it were not the same thing. He got up and went to the kitchen for water. He stood at the counter and drank half a glass and looked at the window, at the dark city. His father had been 42 when he lost the hotel. He'd spent the next 6 years trying to get it back and running out of money and getting sick. And then he'd spent the remaining years of his life in a chair by a window, and he had never, not once in Landon's memory, talked about it with bitterness. He talked about it the way you talk about weather, a thing that had happened, an unfortunate thing. Landon had respected that about his father at the time. Now, older, with his own daughter asleep down the hall and his own years of making it work, and the box open on the table and the name Victoria Hale in his head, he understood that what his father had done wasn't the absence of bitterness. It was the management of it, a daily, deliberate management. He finished the water and rinsed the glass and put it in the rack. He went back to bed. He didn't sleep quickly, but eventually he did sleep. At Miriam's office the next morning, Patrick had set up a presentation on the conference room wall, a flowchart of the ownership chain, documents photographed and annotated, a timeline that started with the original incorporation of Royal Crest Corporation under Robert Pierce and traced through the transfers, the board actions, the refinancings, all the way to the current structure. Miriam walked him through it with the same unhurried precision she brought to everything. She pointed to each node in the chain, explained what it represented, explained where the fraud was embedded, and how it could be demonstrated. The picture that emerged was not simple, but it was coherent. The original theft had been engineered by 2 men, both now dead, who had been minority partners in the original corporation. They had used a period when Robert Pierce was managing a cash flow crisis to manufacture the fraudulent debt instruments, then used those instruments to trigger a forced share transfer that the forged signatures had authorized. From there, the ownership had moved twice more over the following years, not through fraud, just through ordinary business transactions, until it had landed in the current holding structure. The current majority holder is a private equity group called Brennan Salter Capital, Miriam said. They acquired the hotel 11 years ago in what was, from their perspective, a standard acquisition. They likely have no knowledge of the original fraud. Does that matter? Landon asked. For the criminal aspect, yes. For the ownership claim, it complicates things but doesn't necessarily defeat them. There is precedent for unwinding fraudulent title transfer chains, even through subsequent good faith purchases, particularly where the fraud was deliberate and documented, and the injured party was actively deceived. She took off her glasses. I want to be honest with you about the difficulty of this. We are going to be fighting people who have resources significantly larger than yours, who will retain counsel specifically to protect their position. This will not be quick. I understand. It may take a year. It could take longer. I understand. She looked at him steadily. I've been doing this for 15 years. I've seen stronger cases fall apart, and I've seen cases that looked impossible succeed. What I'm telling you right now is that the documentation your father left behind is exceptional. He built a record that most people in his situation never would have had the discipline to build. It's the foundation of everything we can do here. Landon looked at the timeline on the wall. The name Robert Pierce at the beginning of it, in a clean rectangular box, connected by lines to everything that followed. He knew it would matter eventually, Landon said. He just didn't know when. Miriam was quiet for a moment. The shareholder meeting for Brennan Salter's hotel portfolio is in 6 weeks, she said. They hold these quarterly, and the next one falls within the window. If I file the claim and simultaneously petition for emergency injunctive relief on the basis of the fraud documentation, we can force the ownership question into that meeting. It puts pressure on the timeline. It's aggressive. Do it. She nodded once. Then we need to spend the next 3 weeks building the supplementary record. I need you available. I need you responsive. I need you to go through your father's papers again and flag anything I haven't seen yet. I'll go through everything again tonight. Good. She picked up her pen. Go home and spend the weekend with your daughter, Landon, because after Monday, we're in it. He took Chloe to the park on Saturday. It was mid-November now, cold enough for jackets, the trees stripped and gray, the paths covered in a wet layer of leaves that had been rained on twice. They bought hot chocolate from the cart near the east entrance and walked the long loop around the pond. Chloe had her sketchbook in her backpack, which she carried everywhere, though she didn't take it out. She walked with her hot chocolate in both hands and her chin tucked slightly into her jacket collar, and they talked about various things. A project she had at school, a book she'd finished, an argument between two of her classmates that she described with the particular detached fairness of someone who'd listened to both sides and found them both partly wrong. He didn't bring up the case. She didn't ask. There was a comfortable understanding between them that some things were in motion and would continue to be in motion, and that talking about them every day wasn't what either of them needed. At the south end of the loop, where there was a bench overlooking the narrowest point of the pond, they sat. The water was dark and still. A single duck was working its way along the far edge with the weary efficiency of an animal that had decided against making anything of the afternoon. "Dad," Chloe said. "Yeah. When this is over, whatever happens, can we go back?" He looked at her. "To the hotel?" "To the exhibition. They have a spring edition. I looked it up." She turned her hot chocolate in her hands. "I just want to go and look at the paintings without anyone making me feel bad about being there." He put his arm around her. She leaned against him, which she still did, sometimes, in quiet moments, and which he was aware enough of his own mortality to know wouldn't last forever. "Yeah," he said. "We're going back." She nodded. She didn't say anything else. They sat there until the duck disappeared around the curve of the far bank, and then they walked back through the gray park toward the car. The following 3 weeks were the hardest stretch of the whole thing, though not in the ways Landon had expected. Miriam's team moved quickly once they were in it. The filing went in. The petition was submitted. The legal machinery started turning, which meant paperwork, which meant evenings at the kitchen table that stretched past 11. Gerald from 4B coming over twice to help him parse language he couldn't interpret on his own. It meant a deposition session in Miriam's conference room that lasted 6 hours and left him feeling scraped clean, and it meant phone calls he had to take outside in the parking lot at work while trying to sound coherent in a 15-minute window during a shift. It meant, on one particular Wednesday evening, sitting across from Miriam and Patrick, while Miriam told him that Brennan Salter's counsel had responded to the filing with a preliminary motion designed to delay, and watching the controlled way Miriam described this and understanding from the controlled quality of it that the other side was treating this seriously. "Good," Miriam said when she told him. "A delay motion means they're nervous. If they weren't nervous, they'd have filed a motion to dismiss. The fact that they want to slow it down means they've seen the documentation and they don't like what they see. How long does the delay buy them? We'll fight it, maximum 3 weeks. Then we're in the shareholders' meeting." She looked at him over her glasses. "How are you doing?" It was the first time she'd asked him that. He appreciated that she'd waited until it was actually relevant. "I'm tired," he said, "but I'm okay." "Landon." She set her pen down. "I've been in rooms with a lot of people going through things like this, the ones who don't make it to the finish line. It's usually not because the case falls apart. It's because they run out of something before the case resolves. Patience, money, Nerve. She looked at him steadily. You're the one who has to decide which of those is your limiting factor. He thought about it honestly for a moment. None of them, he said. Not yet. She picked up her pen. Then let's keep going. He went home that night to find Chloe asleep at the kitchen table, her cheek on her sketchbook, her pencil still in her hand. She'd fallen asleep drawing. It had happened before. She got absorbed and lost track of time, and the tiredness caught up with her before she'd decided to stop. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, looking at her. She had his nose and Rachel's eyes and her grandfather's stubbornness. The same flat refusal to let a thing go that Robert Pierce had brought to the Royal Crest Corporation before two men with forged documents had taken it from him. It skipped nothing, that stubbornness. It moved through the family like something organic, like a trait too fundamental to be interrupted. He went to her carefully. He lifted the pencil from her hand, marked her page, and closed the sketchbook gently. Then he picked her up. She was getting heavy. She was nearly 10, but she still weighed less than 30 consecutive days of second-guessing yourself, and carried her down the hall to her room. She stirred as he set her down. I was drawing, she murmured. I know, it'll still be there in the morning. I was drawing the hotel. I figured. She was already most of the way back under. The real one this time, she said, barely audible. Not my version. The real one. He pulled the blanket over her. He stood in the dark room for a moment. The real one. He went back to the kitchen. He sat down at the table where she'd been sleeping and opened his laptop and sent Miriam 3 follow-up points that had occurred to him on the drive home. Connections between his father's notes and one of the supplementary documents Patrick had flagged last week that he wasn't sure Miriam had caught. He hit send. He closed the laptop. He sat in the kitchen for a while longer, in the quiet apartment, in the particular stillness of a life balanced at the edge of something. 6 weeks. That was the window. He wasn't going to waste any of it. The morning of the shareholders' meeting, Landon woke at 5. Not because his alarm went off, because he was done sleeping and his body knew it. He lay still for a few minutes in the dark, listening to the apartment. The radiator. A bus somewhere on the main road. The particular silence of Chloe still asleep down the hall, which had a different quality than regular silence. Softer, more complete. He got up and made coffee and stood at the kitchen window while it brewed, looking at the street below. The city was still mostly dark, the streetlights doing their pale work on the wet pavement. It had rained overnight. The leaves that had collected in the gutter had been pushed into a dark line along the curb. He thought about his father, not in a ceremonial way, not the formal, deliberate act of remembering that people performed at graves or anniversaries, just the ordinary intrusion of a person who'd been gone long enough that his presence arrived sideways, unexpectedly, in the small hours of a morning that mattered. Robert Pierce had stood in front of a building on Caldwell Avenue when Landon was 3 years old and said, according to family story, "This is ours." Not with pride exactly, with the particular satisfaction of a man who had built something difficult and was acknowledging the difficulty of it. 21 years. That was how long it had been since it stopped being theirs. Landon poured his coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and read through his notes one last time. He didn't need to. He'd been through everything Miriam had prepared until he could recite the key points without looking. He read them anyway. It was something to do with his hands. At 6:30, he heard Chloe's door open, the soft steps in the hall, and then she appeared in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas, hair loose, squinting at the light. "You're already up," she said. "I never really went down." She looked at him, at the notes on the table, at the suit hanging on the back of the kitchen chair, which he'd laid out the night before. The same way he'd laid out Chloe's green dress the morning of the exhibition, he realized. Something about the parallel of it wasn't lost on him. "Today's the day," she said. It wasn't a question. "Today's the day." She came to the table and sat across from him, folding her legs under herself the way she always did on chairs that were too high. She looked at the suit. "Is it going to work?" she asked. "Miriam thinks yes. I think yes." "But you're nervous." "I'm very nervous." She seemed to appreciate the honesty. "What are you nervous about specifically?" He thought about it. "That I've been carrying this for 6 years and I've let myself believe in it, and if it doesn't go the right way today, I'm going to have to figure out what to do with that." Chloe was quiet for a moment. Grandpa built it, she said. He did. Then it's supposed to go the right way. It was a 9-year-old's logic, the kind that couldn't be argued with because it wasn't operating on the same terms as doubt. He looked at her across the table, her certainty, her complete and uncomplicated faith in the basic principle that things built honestly should be returned to the people they were taken from. And something in his chest settled. Not disappeared, just settled. Go eat something, he said. Mrs. Adiemi is coming at 8. Chloe unfolded herself from the chair. At the kitchen entrance, she paused. Dad? Yeah. Wear the good tie, not the blue one. He looked at the suit. The tie was already laid out. It was the blue one. Which one's the good one? He said. The gray one with the thin stripe. It's in the drawer under your work shirts. He hadn't known she'd paid that much attention. Okay, he said. She went to get ready. He arrived at the Brennan Salter Capital offices at 8:45, 15 minutes before the meeting was scheduled to begin. Miriam was already in the lobby with Patrick and 2 additional members of her team, a financial forensics specialist named Adeze, who had spent the previous 3 weeks reconstructing the original corporate records, and a second attorney named Bowman, who specialized in injunctive relief proceedings. Miriam looked him over when he came through the door. Good suit, she said. My daughter picked the tie. Smart kid. She turned to the group. We're in conference room B on the 4th floor. Brennan Salter's legal team is already up there, which means they've been here since at least 8. That's their tell. They're rattled and they're trying to look prepared. She looked at each of them in turn. We go in, we present in the order we discussed. We do not get pulled into side arguments about timeline or valuation. Those are delay tactics. Every time they try to redirect, we come back to the documents. The documents are what they can't argue with. Clear? A round of nods. Landon's included. They took the elevator to the 4th floor. Bump. Victoria Hale had been in the building since 7:45. She hadn't planned to be that early. She'd planned to arrive at 8:30, which was 15 minutes before the meeting, which was the time she always arrived for quarterly shareholder sessions. Early enough to be settled, not so early that it looked like she'd been anxious about it. Punctuality was a form of communication in rooms like these. You arrived when you meant to arrive, not when your nerves pushed you out the door. She'd been pushed out the door at 7:15. She was in conference room B now, with a coffee she wasn't drinking, reviewing the quarter's operational figures on her laptop. The numbers were good. Occupancy was up 4% year over year. The renovation of the East Wing had come in 2 weeks ahead of schedule. The fall exhibition had driven a measurable uptick in weekend bookings. She'd been running the Royal Crest for 7 years, and the hotel was performing at the highest level of her tenure. She knew this because she tracked everything, every metric, every margin, every line item on every departmental budget. That was how she operated. That was how she'd built the reputation that had gotten her the CEO role at 22. Young, too young, everyone had said so, and she'd responded by being so completely prepared for every room she walked into that the question of her age eventually stopped mattering. She was prepared today. She was always prepared. But she'd been up since 5, and the coffee was cold, and she kept reading the same sentence on her screen without it landing. The filing had come through Brennan Salter's legal department 7 weeks ago and been forwarded to her with a brief summary and the note. Brought to your attention for awareness, legal team is managing. She'd read the summary. She'd flagged questions. She'd scheduled 2 calls with Brennan Salter's counsel, both of which had been reassuring in tone. We'll handle it, likely a nuisance claim. The delay motion should buy us time to assess. And she'd accepted that assessment because Brennan Salter's legal team was very good and because she trusted process. She'd read the full claim documents herself 2 weeks ago. That had been a different experience. The fraud allegations were specific. The documentation referenced in the filing was, according to a private assessment she'd quietly commissioned from a retired corporate attorney she knew, unusually detailed for a claim of this age. The retired attorney had used the word unusual 3 times in the assessment, and each time he'd used it, Victoria had understood that he was being careful with his language. The thing that had been sitting in her chest for 2 weeks, the thing she couldn't quite name because naming it would mean sitting with it, was not fear exactly. It was more like the feeling of standing on a surface you had believed was solid and beginning to register, through some vibration too faint to be certain of, that you might have been wrong about the solid part. She hadn't taken the hotel from anyone. She knew that. She'd been 22 and recently promoted and given a mandate to restructure operations in a property she'd had no hand in acquiring. Whatever had happened before her arrival was not hers, but she was the face of the current operation, and she understood enough about how these things worked to know that faces were what rooms remembered. The door to the conference room opened, and Brennan Salter's lead counsel, a man named Forrester, came in. He was followed by two associates. He sat across from her, opened his folder, and said, "They're on their way up." "Who's their team?" Victoria asked. "Miriam Cho, corporate fraud litigation." "She's good, Mom." He said it with the compressed acknowledgement of someone complimenting a rival's form. "Two attorneys and two specialists." "How many are there total?" "5, plus the plaintiff." "Who's the plaintiff?" Forrester looked down at his folder. "Pierce, Landon Pierce." The name didn't mean anything to her. She turned it over. Nothing. "Do we know him?" she asked. "No prior relationship with the hotel or with Brennan Salter." She nodded and looked back at her laptop screen. The sentence she'd been trying to read was still there. The door opened again and the room shifted. Landon came in last, behind Miriam and the rest of the team, and he took the seat at the far end of the table that Miriam had told him to take. Visible from the door, clear line of sight to the screen where Adaeze's materials would be projected. He'd walked into a lot of rooms in his life. Rooms where he'd had to make a case for himself, prove something, convince someone. Job interviews where he'd known walking in that the other candidates had credentials he didn't. Conversations with landlords. The year after Rachel died, when he'd had to go to the benefits office every 2 weeks and explain, again, the same things to different people with the same forms. He'd learned in those rooms to keep his hands still. He kept his hands still now. He looked at the Brennan Salter side of the table. 2 men in expensive suits, a woman in a gray blazer. And then he looked at Victoria Hale, who was sitting at the far end of their side, and she was looking at her laptop screen and not at him. He recognized her immediately. The same bearing, the same dark hair, pulled back smooth. The charcoal blazer had been replaced by a navy one, but the posture was identical. The particular uprightness of someone who had made a decision long ago about how they presented themselves in rooms and never deviated from it. She hadn't looked at him yet. He looked away from her, at the screen, at Miriam settling her materials, and he exhaled slowly through his nose and kept his hands flat on the table. Miriam opened without preamble. "Thank you for convening this session. I'll be brief with the framing and then we'll move directly into documentation, because the documentation is what this is about." She nodded to Adaez, who brought up the first slide, the timeline. Robert Pierce incorporated Royal Crest Corporation 24 years ago with 2 minority partners. He financed construction of the Royal Crest Hotel over the following 3 years. He operated the hotel as majority shareholder and chief executive for 8 years. In the 12th year of the hotel's operation, through a coordinated scheme involving fraudulent debt instruments, forged transfer signatures, and falsified board quorum records, Robert Pierce was stripped of his ownership and control. He spent the following years documenting what had been done to him and ran out of resources to act on it before his death. The room was quiet. Forrester was writing. His associates were watching the screen. Miriam continued, "We are not here to relitigate ancient history. We are here because the documentation Robert Pierce assembled, now in the possession of his son and legal heir Landon Pierce, constitutes a complete and demonstrable record of fraudulent title transfer. And because that title transfer is the foundational event in the ownership chain that leads to the current controlling interest held by Brennan Salter Capital." Adaez moved through the slides. The forged signatures, shown in side-by-side comparison with verified examples of Robert Pierce's actual signature, the difference visible to any eye in the room. The debt instruments, reconstructed by Adaez through financial records subpoenaed over the previous weeks. The fabrication of the default event documented at each step. The board meeting minutes he date-stamped, attendance records cross-referenced with independent records showing that 2 of the listed attendees had been in other cities on the date in question. Forrester tried twice to interrupt with procedural objections. Miriam answered both without breaking rhythm, the way you answer questions from someone in the back row, while continuing to address the whole room. At the 20-minute mark, Bowman took over the legal argument, the tolling precedents, the chain of title case law, the specific statutory basis for the ownership claim. It was dense. It was thorough. Bowman delivered it with the flat, precise affect of someone who knew that excessive emotion in a legal argument reads as desperation, and that the coldest presentation of the strongest case was always more persuasive than passion. Landon sat still through all of it. He didn't look at Victoria again. He looked at the screen, at the documents he'd spent 3 months living with, watching them become something formal and real in a way that his father's careful notes in a yellowing box had never quite been. At the 40-minute mark, Miriam said, "I'll now invite questions." The questions from Brennan Salter's side came in 2 categories. The first category was genuine, specific, technical questions about the documentation, the chain of evidence, the legal argument for tolling the statute of limitations. Miriam answered these directly and in detail. The second category was the delay tactic variety. Broad questions about timeline, about valuation methodology, about procedural standing, and Miriam answered these with the practiced patience of someone who had seen this playbook many times and was neither fooled by it nor visibly annoyed by it. Victoria hadn't spoken. Landon had noticed this. She'd been writing periodically on the notepad in front of her, not looking up when Forrester spoke, not looking at the screen during the evidence presentation. She was looking at the documents themselves. Adeyeze had provided printed packages to everyone at the table at the start, and Victoria's was open in front of her, and she had been reading it steadily since the presentation began. She looked up now, for the first time in 40 minutes, directly at Landon. He held it. It lasted about 3 seconds. Her expression was not the expression from the corridor of the hotel, the closed, assessing neutrality of someone who had made up their mind before speaking. This expression was different, more complicated. Something working in it that she was controlling carefully but hadn't fully resolved. She looked back down at the documents. Forrester began a long procedural argument about the valuation framework being premature at this stage of proceedings, and Miriam answered it, and the meeting continued. Whoa. It took another 40 minutes to get to the vote. There were 3 Brennan Salter principals in the room in addition to the legal team, and they had been listening in the way that people with financial stakes listen, measuring the information against the risk, not the narrative. When the procedural argument reached its conclusion, Miriam's conclusion, which was that the emergency injunctive petition had already been granted by the court, and that the purpose of today's meeting was not to relitigate, but to address the remediation framework. One of the principals, a compact man named Hargrove, who had said nothing for the past 2 hours, leaned forward and said, "What exactly is being proposed?" Miriam looked at him steadily. "Mr. Pierce is seeking restoration of majority ownership interest in the Royal Crest Hotel, consistent with the original Pierce family holding, plus a structured settlement addressing the historical value of the fraudulently transferred interest." Hargrove looked at the lawyer beside him. The lawyer looked at Forrester. Forrester looked at his documents with the expression of a man reviewing a hand he'd been hoping would improve and hadn't. "And the alternative," Hargrove said, "not a question, exactly. More the considered acknowledgement of someone reaching for the shape of the whole thing." "The alternative," Miriam said, "is litigation, which, given the quality of the documentation, will be extended, expensive, and thus, based on the precedents I've outlined, very likely to resolve in the same place at significantly greater cost and time to all parties." Hargrove was quiet for a moment. He looked at the other 2 principals. A brief exchange of looks, the kind that contains a full conversation, compressed. "We'll need 30 minutes, Hargrove said. Miriam nodded. "Of course. What?" They waited in the corridor on the 4th floor. That's Landon, Miriam, the team. There was a small seating area with gray chairs and a low table, and Patrick went and found coffee, and they sat in the particular suspended silence of people who have done everything they can do and are now waiting for the world to catch up. Miriam sat beside Landon. "How are you doing?" she said quietly. "Ask me in 30 minutes. Fair?" She looked down the corridor. "You held the room well." "I didn't say anything." "That's what I mean." She paused. "Your father's documentation was the case. Every argument Forrester made was answered by something your father wrote in that box. He built the case. We assembled it, but Robert Pierce is the reason we're sitting here today. Landon looked at his hands. He never knew, he said. He put all of it together, and he never got to use it. No. She didn't try to soften that. He didn't. They sat with it for a moment, the unadorned reality of it. But you're using it, Miriam said. He looked up. And his granddaughter's going to see the inside of that hotel, she said. Not as a guest, as a Pierce. He didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. The 30 minutes stretched. Landon's coffee went cold. Patrick checked his phone. Adaze reviewed something on her laptop. Bowman stared at the ceiling with the practiced composure of a man who had waited in a lot of corridors. At the 28-minute mark, the conference room door opened. Hargrove was in the doorway. Mr. Pierce, he said, if you'd come back in. The room had reorganized itself subtly in the break. Forrester's associates had shifted. The printed documents had been restacked. Hargrove stood at the head of the table instead of sitting, which meant he was going to say something brief. Victoria was still in her seat. She was looking at Landon when he came in. This time she didn't look away. Hargrove said, We've reviewed the materials and we've assessed our position. Given the strength of the documentation and the terms of the injunction, Brennan Salter Capital is prepared to recognize the Pierce claim and enter into remediation negotiations immediately. He paused. Effective upon execution of the transfer framework, Mr. Pierce will assume majority ownership interest in Royal Crest Hotel and related operating entities. Miriam said, We'll want the terms in writing by end of business today. Agreed. It was that clean, which was the strange thing about it. Not that it was easy, because it wasn't easy. It had been 6 weeks of brutal preparation and 21 years of waiting before that. But the moment itself was clean, a sentence, a nod, a set of documents that would be drafted and signed. Landon sat in the chair and heard Miriam confirm the terms, and heard Hargrove's responses, and followed the exchange the way you follow something important that you've been building toward for so long that the arrival of it has a slightly unreal quality, like watching something through glass. He thought about the parking lot 2 blocks from the hotel, the ironed shirt, the tin of polish that might have been 5 years old. He thought about Chloe's hand in his on the sidewalk, cold fingers, holding harder than usual. He thought about his father in a chair by a window. He was aware of Victoria Hale across the room. He was aware without looking at her, the way you're aware of something you've decided not to address yet. When Hargrove finished and sat down, there was a brief administrative flurry. Patrick and Bowman and the Brennan Salter associates coordinating on the documentation timeline, the specific language of the transfer framework. Miriam leaned over and said quietly, That's it. That's the case. Yeah, Landon said. You understand what just happened? I do. You own the Royal Crest Hotel. He looked at the conference room wall, the window beyond it, the gray December sky. I know, he said. They were filing out when she caught up with him, not in a dramatic way, no hand on his arm, no urgent step. She came alongside him in the corridor outside conference room B, and he became aware of her presence and slowed, and she slowed with him, and the rest of the group moved ahead to the elevator. He turned to her. Up close, she looked different than she had in the lobby of the hotel, not younger or older, more human. Like the version of herself in the corridor that morning had been a managed presentation, and this version was what was underneath it when the management was under strain. She said, You were in the hotel. It wasn't a question. She'd placed him, during the meeting probably, during the 30-minute break, maybe earlier. October, he said, with my daughter. Her jaw tightened slightly. The lobby incident. The lobby incident. She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the floor, then back at him. I didn't know who you were. I know that. I'm not saying it to excuse it. I'm saying it because I want to be clear that it wasn't about you specifically. She stopped. Which is its own problem, isn't it? It wasn't about you specifically. It was about what I decided you were, which is... She stopped again. Worse, he said. She looked at him. Yes. He considered her. The controlled composure of her, the quality of someone who had spent a career building a specific presentation of themselves and was standing in a corridor being honest about the gap between the presentation and the thing underneath. "My daughter asked me why you treated us that way," he said. "She asked me if it was because we were poor." Victoria's expression shifted. Something moved in it that she didn't control quickly enough. "What did you tell her?" she asked. "I told her it was part of it." She looked away down the corridor. The elevator was at the far end, its doors closed. The overhead lights hummed their faint electrical hum. "How old is she?" Victoria said. 9. A silence, brief but heavy. "I'm sorry," Victoria said. Not formally, not the reflexive apology of someone managing a liability, just the two words said plainly in the corridor. "For what happened that morning, for how I handled it, and for—" She looked at him. "For whatever that cost your daughter, whatever she took home with her." He looked at her. He wasn't sure yet what he wanted to do with the apology. Not in this corridor, not today, not 20 minutes after the room next door had handed him something that had been 21 years in coming. He needed space from the momentum of the morning to know what he actually felt about any of it. "We'll be in contact about the transition," he said, "the operational structure." She nodded. "I understand." He held her gaze for a moment longer. "My father built that hotel," he said. "He named it the Royal Crest because of a book he loved. He thought the name was right for it. He was a stubborn man." He paused. "I'm a stubborn man, too." She looked at him steadily. "I'm beginning to understand that," she said. He nodded once. Then he turned and walked down the corridor toward the elevator, and he pressed the button, and he waited with his hands still at his sides while it came. He called Mrs. Adeyemi from the car. "How did it go?" she asked, before he could say anything. "It went," he said. A pause. Then she made a sound, something between a laugh and a cry, that was so unguarded and genuine that he felt the thing he'd been holding in his chest all day finally shift. Not dissolve, just move. Make room. "She's going to want to know everything," Mrs. Adeyemi said. "I know." "She's been drawing all day. She drew the hotel 4 times. He pulled out of the parking structure into the December street, the gray sky above the buildings, the city moving around him in its ordinary way, unchanged, still itself, as if nothing particular had happened. Which was the thing about cities, like, they didn't adjust their pace for individual moments. They kept moving, and you moved with them or you didn't, and either way the city went on. He drove home. He drove through the streets that he knew, the way. You know something you've navigated for years without thinking about it, and he thought about what he was going to tell Chloe and how he was going to tell it and whether she would understand what it meant. Not the legal mechanics of it, but the weight of it, the history under it, the man in the chair by the window and the box on the top shelf, and the 21 years of something sitting still and waiting. He thought she would understand it. She was 10 in 2 months. She had his father's stubbornness and her mother's eyes, and a sketchbook full of the same building drawn from every angle she'd been able to imagine. He thought she would understand it completely. He parked the Civic 2 blocks from the apartment, same spot as always, and walked the 2 blocks home in the December cold with his hands in his coat pockets and the gray tie with the thin stripes still around his neck. And when he came through the building door and climbed the stairs and put his key in the lock, he could already hear, from inside the apartment, the sound of Chloe and Mrs. Adeyemi talking, the particular rhythm of Chloe's voice when she was in the middle of explaining something she cared about. He opened the door. The transfer paperwork took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of documents and signatures and conference calls, and Miriam's team working through the structural details with Brennan Salter's attorneys. And through all of it, Landon went to work at the hardware store and picked up Chloe from school and made dinner and sat at the kitchen table in the evenings reading through whatever Miriam had sent him that day. He told exactly 4 people: Miriam, Gerald, Mrs. Adeyemi, and Chloe. Nobody else. Not his coworkers. Not the guys he sometimes had a beer with on Friday evenings. Not the extended family scattered across 2 states who sent Christmas cards and occasional texts. He wasn't sure why he kept it contained. Maybe because he'd learned, in the years since Rachel, that the things that mattered most had a fragility in the period before they were fully real, and that talking about them too widely before they'd settled into fact had a way of disturbing something. Or maybe he just didn't want to have to explain it more times than necessary until he knew what it actually meant for his life going forward. Chloe had taken the news the way he'd expected. Not with screaming or jumping, but with a long, still silence followed by a lot of questions. Specific, logical questions, asked in the order they occurred to her, which was the way she processed everything large. So we own it now? Us? Majority ownership, yes. There are some complexities in how it's structured, but effectively, yes. Do we have to live there? He'd laughed at that one genuinely. No, it's a business. We own the business. Do you run it? I'm working on figuring out what that looks like. She'd thought about that for a moment. What about the woman? The one from the lobby? She's still the CEO for now. She runs the day-to-day operation. Another pause. Are you going to fire her? I don't know yet. Chloe had looked at him with that expression she sometimes got, the one that meant she was evaluating the answer, not just accepting it. What would Grandpa do? He hadn't expected that question. He sat with it. He'd think about it carefully, Landon said finally, and he wouldn't do anything out of anger. She'd nodded, as if that confirmed something she'd already suspected, and picked up her pencil. The first time Landon walked into the Royal Crest Hotel as its owner, he came through the same revolving door he'd walked out of in October. Same doorman, or a different one, he couldn't tell. They wore the same pressed gray coats and held the same neutral expression. The lobby was dressed for winter now, the floral arrangement in the center replaced by something architectural and seasonal, white branches and silver accents, tall and dramatic. He was there for a 9 o'clock meeting with Victoria and the hotel's senior management team. He was wearing the gray tie with the thin stripe. He came 10 minutes early and stood in the lobby for a moment before anyone approached him. He stood where he'd stood in October, near the East Corridor entrance, and looked at the marble floors and the chandeliers and the high ceilings and tried to locate what he felt about being here. It was complicated. He'd expected it to feel like reclamation, like something cinematic and complete. It didn't feel like that. It felt like standing in a building that was beautiful and that had a history he was still sorting through, and that now had his name attached to it in ways that would require a great deal of ordinary work to manage. A woman from the management team appeared to escort him upstairs, and he went. No. Victoria was already in the second-floor conference room with 5 other people when he arrived. Department heads. He'd been given a briefing document with their names and roles. The head of operations, the director of guest experience, the food and beverage manager, the events coordinator, the head of facilities. They were all watching the door when he came in with the particular careful attention of people who have been briefed on a situation and are managing their reaction to it. He could see in their faces the specific calculation that happened when they looked at him, the suit, the age, the absence of the markers they associated with the kind of person who owned a hotel like this. He'd expected it. He didn't let it land. He sat at the head of the table, which was where the escort had indicated, and he put down the folder he'd brought and looked at the room. "Good morning," he said. "I want to start with something before we get into the operational agenda. I know this transition has been fast, and I know it comes with questions you probably haven't had direct answers to yet. So I want to be straightforward with you about what I'm thinking and what I'm not thinking, because I believe people do better work when they're not trying to interpret silence." He had their attention completely. "I'm not here to dismantle what's been built. The hotel has performed well under the current management structure, and I have no interest in changing things for the sake of change. What I'm here to do is make some substantive changes to how this hotel relates to the people who come through it, guests, employees, community members. And I want to do that collaboratively, not by decree." He looked around the table. "I also want to say directly to Ms. Hale and to this team that what I know about how this hotel has been run operationally is genuinely impressive. That matters to me. I'm not walking in here with contempt for the work that's been done." Victoria, seated to his right, was watching him with an expression he couldn't read clearly. Not hostile, not relieved, something in between, held carefully. "What kinds of changes?" the director of guest experience asked. Her name was Sandra Reyes, and she had the direct manner of someone who'd been in hospitality long enough to distrust vagueness. "The culture of the entrance," Landon said. The criteria by which guests are assessed when they arrive, the way discretion is applied, who gets the benefit of the doubt, who gets scrutiny. He paused. This hotel has a history of treating some guests as if their presence requires justification. I want that to change, not as a PR initiative, as a genuine operational standard. Sandra Reyes looked at him steadily. That's going to require training. I know. Real training, not a one-day session. Ongoing. I agree. It's also going to push back from some of our longer-term clientele who value the... She paused, choosing her word carefully. Selectivity. I know that too. He looked at her. I'm not interested in running a hotel that makes its reputation by making certain people feel unwelcome. If some of the clientele who value that leave, they leave. We'll build a different clientele. The room was quiet for a moment. Not uncomfortable quiet. Thinking quiet. The head of operations, a man named Garrett, who had the build of someone who'd once played college football and the manner of someone who'd spent 20 years having to be more careful than his size suggested, said, "What else?" Landon opened his folder. So, he'd spent the 3 weeks of transition paperwork thinking about what he actually wanted to do. Not in an abstract way. He'd been specific. He'd written things down, crossed things out, rewritten them. He'd talked to Gerald, who had a practical mind for implementation. He'd talked to Chloe, who had the uncanny ability to identify when something was being done for show versus when it was being done for real. What he brought to the table that morning was not a vision statement. It was a list of specific, concrete initiatives. The scholarship program was the one he'd thought about longest. Single-parent families, children from single-parent households who showed interest in the arts, in hospitality, in business. The hotel's children's exhibition already existed. He wanted to build something adjacent to it, a sponsored access program that brought children from the city's public school system into the hotel for workshops, mentorship sessions, direct engagement with working artists and professionals. Not charity framed as charity, opportunity framed as opportunity. The community events proposal was simpler. 1 weekend per month, a portion of the hotel's public spaces opened for free community programming, music, art, educational talks, no dress code enforced at the entrance, no differential treatment based on how people arrived. The employee benefits restructuring was something he'd asked Miriam's team to assess separately: wages, healthcare, the specific terms of how the hotel's lower wage workers were compensated relative to the margins the hotel was generating. He hadn't brought specific numbers to this meeting yet, but he told the room it was coming. He presented all of it plainly, without theater. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment in a different way than before. Not the waiting quiet of people managing reactions, but the active quiet of people actually thinking. Sandra Reyes said, "The scholarship program. Who funds it?" "The hotel funds it, as a line item in the operating budget." "How much?" He told her. She wrote it down. "The community days," Garrett said. "What spaces specifically?" "The East Corridor and the ballroom on the lower level, not the primary dining spaces on weekends. I understand that's peak revenue time. We work around the commercial schedule." Garrett nodded slowly. "Staffing on those days, paid. Nobody works the community events for free or as a favor. It's on the clock." Garrett looked at him with an expression that was recalibrating. "Okay," he said. Victoria had been quiet through all of it. She'd been writing, her notepad was covered, but she hadn't spoken since his opening statement. Now she said, "The entrance culture change. You said it's not a PR initiative. What does that mean in practice?" "It means the training isn't about how to look welcoming. It means examining the actual decision-making process at the door. What triggers a security call? What triggers an escort? What assumptions are being made about people based on how they're dressed or what they're driving?" He looked at her directly. "It means the people working this hotel understand that their job is to welcome guests, not to filter them." She held his gaze. There was something working in her face, something honest and uncomfortable. "That's going to be a harder conversation than the training," she said. "I know. It means acknowledging that it's been happening." "It means acknowledging that it's been happening," he confirmed. "To the staff, internally, without turning it into a public flagellation of anyone." He paused. I'm not interested in humiliating anyone. I've been on the receiving end of that. I know what it costs and what it doesn't buy. The room was very still. Victoria looked down at her notepad. She wrote something, then she looked back up. I can work with this, she said. The meetings that followed over the next weeks were not smooth. Landon hadn't expected smooth. He'd told himself he hadn't expected it, and mostly he'd been right. There were arguments about budget allocation, about implementation timelines, about the legal review required for the benefits restructuring, about which community organizations to partner with for the monthly events, and how to structure the relationships without it becoming transactional in the wrong ways. There was a specific, difficult conversation with the hotel's longest-serving security manager, a man named Briggs, who had been at the Royal Crest for 14 years and who sat across from Landon in the small office adjacent to the security station on the ground floor and said, with the blunt honesty of a man who had decided to say the thing directly, "You're telling me we've been doing it wrong. I'm telling you the standard you've been operating by was set by someone else, and I'm changing the standard. Those are the same thing. They're not, actually. One puts the blame on you personally. The other acknowledges that you followed a policy that shouldn't have been the policy." Briggs looked at him for a long moment. He was a large man with a careful face, the face of someone who'd spent years reading rooms and making quick assessments, which was precisely the skill that needed recalibration. "You were here in October," Briggs said. "You and your kid." Landon hadn't brought it up. He hadn't known Briggs had made the connection. "Yes," he said. "I wasn't the one who called it. I want you to know that. That came from upstairs." "I know. But my guys executed it." He looked at the table. "That bothers me. Now that I know, it bothers me." "Good," Landon said, not unkindly. "That's exactly where you need to be for the new standard to mean something." Briggs looked at him. Something shifted in his expression. Not entirely comfortable, but engaged, present. "What does the new standard look like specifically?" he asked. And they got to work. Gerald came to see the hotel for the first time on a Thursday evening in January, 2 weeks after the first community event had been held in the East Corridor and the ballroom level. Landon had invited him, had wanted him to see it. Gerald had put on a jacket and tie for the occasion, which Landon had told him wasn't necessary, and which Gerald had done anyway. They walked the lobby together. Gerald moved through it slowly, touching nothing, looking at everything with the attentive quiet of a man absorbing a space. "How's it feel?" Gerald asked. "Strange," Landon said honestly. "It's a lot. Operationally, financially, I'm learning things every day that I didn't know I needed to learn. There's a revenue management system I still don't fully understand. There's a supplier contract that's been flagged as unfavorable, and I've been going back and forth with the purchasing team about it for 2 weeks." "That's not what I asked." Landon looked at him. "I know. How does it feel?" He stood in the lobby, the marble floors, the chandeliers, the tall ceilings, and tried to answer honestly. "Like I'm standing in something my father built," he said. "And like the work of making it something he'd actually be proud of is longer than I expected, and harder than I expected, and also more mine than I expected." He paused. "I thought it would feel like winning. It doesn't really feel like that." "What does it feel like?" "Like the beginning of something, which is different." Gerald nodded slowly. "That's the right answer." "I wasn't trying to give the right answer." "I know, that's why it is one." They walked through to the East Corridor where the residual setup from the community event was still partially visible. Chairs stacked near the wall, a banner from the partnering arts organization folded on a side table waiting to be picked up. Gerald looked at the banner, looked at the space. "You held this for free?" he said. "1 Saturday a month. How many people came?" "First one, about 80, more than we expected." Gerald looked around the corridor, at the marble, the chandeliers, the vaulted space that had been built to house people with money and was now being opened, monthly, to people without much of it. "Your father would have liked that," Gerald said. Landon looked at the space, too. "Yeah," he said. "He would have." Victoria knocked on his office door on a Thursday in late January. He'd been given an office on the 4th floor, a room with a window and a desk that had belonged to the previous ownership's representative who had visited quarterly. It still felt like someone else's room. He'd moved the desk to face the window instead of the door, which was the first thing he'd changed about it, because he thought better when he could see outside. "Do you have a minute?" she said. "Come in." She came in and sat in the chair across from the desk. She was in a different blazer, dark green, which he'd noticed she wore on days that weren't formal meetings, a small departure from the charcoal and navy palette of her formal presentation. He'd started to notice these distinctions the way you notice the small indicators in people you spent real time with. "The scholarship program shortlist is ready," she said. "Sandra and the education coordinator have reviewed the applications. There are 14 candidates for the first cohort." "How many did you get?" 41 applications, which is more than we expected for the first round." "Good." She had a folder, which she set on the desk. He opened it, looked through the first few pages. Children's names, ages, short biographical notes, school affiliations. He read slowly. "One of them," Victoria said, "is a 9-year-old girl from the West Side District. Single father, works in building maintenance. She wants to be a visual artist." He looked up. Victoria's expression was careful but not closed. Something in it was open in a way that it hadn't been in October or in the corridor after the meeting. "I noticed that," she said. "I wanted you to know I noticed." He looked back at the folder. He found the application. The name was Maya, not Chloe, a different child entirely, but the parallel was exact and she had obviously seen it too. "She's in," he said. "I thought she would be." Victoria paused. "All 14 are in if you want my recommendation. The program is funded for 20. We have room." "Then all 14. She made a note. Then she looked up. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Go ahead." "When you came into that meeting in December, the shareholders meeting, you already knew who I was. You'd recognized me from October." "Yes." "You didn't say anything." "No." "Why not?" He considered the question. "Because the meeting wasn't about that. The meeting was about my father's case and the documentation and the ownership claim. Bringing in what happened in October would have made it look personal." "It was personal." "Yes, but it wasn't the point." He looked at her. "The point was the hotel, and what I intended to do with it." She was quiet for a moment, looking at her notepad. "I've been thinking about October," she said. "More than I expected to. I've run through it a lot. What I was thinking, what I was reacting to, how fast I moved to a conclusion." She paused. "I was wrong. Not just wrong by the standard of what turned out to be true about who you were. Wrong by any standard." "I know," he said, not harshly, just plainly. "I'm telling you because I want you to hear it directly from me, not as a management formality." He looked at her across the desk. She was 30 years old and had built a career on precision and control and the careful management of how she presented herself in rooms. And she was sitting in his office with something genuinely uncomfortable on her face that she wasn't trying to manage away. "I heard you," he said. She nodded once. She closed her notepad. "The community event in February," she said. "I'd like to be there, not as oversight, as a participant." He raised an eyebrow slightly. "You want to attend?" "I want to be there when it happens, in the room, not as the CEO managing an initiative, as someone in the room with the people it's for." She looked slightly uncomfortable saying it, which he thought was honest. "I don't know if that's useful to anyone else, but I think it might be useful to me." He thought about it. "Show up early," he said. "Sandra runs the setup, and she'll put you to work." Something that might have been the beginning of a relieved expression moved across Victoria's face and was quickly controlled. "Okay," she said. She stood, picked up her folder, and headed for the door. "Victoria," she turned. "The scholarship candidates," he said. "After the cohort is confirmed, I want them to come for a tour of the hotel, full tour, the exhibition, the ballroom, the kitchen, everything, before the program starts. I want them to understand the place belongs to them as much as it belongs to anyone." She looked at him for a moment. "I'll arrange it," she said. He brought Chloe back on a Saturday morning in February. Not for the exhibition, though the spring exhibition was running and she had her updated list in her backpack, which was longer than the October list and had 5 asterisks instead of 3. They arrived when the hotel opened at 9, before the lobby filled with the weekend crowd, and for a few minutes the space was relatively quiet. Chloe walked through the revolving door and stopped just inside it, the way she'd stopped on the sidewalk in October when she'd first seen the building from down the block. She stood there in the lobby with her backpack on both shoulders and looked up at the chandeliers and the vaulted ceiling and the marble floors spreading out in every direction. "It's the same," she said. "Yes." "But it's different." He looked at her. "What's different?" She thought about it. "The way it feels to stand in it." He understood that completely. Sandra Reyes materialized from the direction of the information desk and came to meet them. She shook Chloe's hand with the gravity of someone taking the introduction seriously. "We've been expecting you," Sandra said to Chloe. "I've been told you have a list." Chloe looked slightly suspicious. "How do you know about the list?" "Your dad mentioned it." Chloe looked at him. He gave her nothing. "I have a list," she confirmed. "Good," Sandra said. "Let's start with the Adara Voss series. It's in the West Gallery, and I'll tell you something about her that isn't in any of the materials." Chloe looked interested in spite of herself. "What?" "She painted the whole series in 3 weeks after her apartment flooded. Everything she owned was water damaged, and those paintings were the first things she made afterward." Sandra started moving toward the West Gallery. "Come on." Chloe followed immediately, already pulling out her sketchbook. Landon stood in the lobby for a moment. The doorman by the revolving door, a different man than the one from October, young, attentive, looked over at him. "Good morning, Mr. Pierce." "Good morning?" He looked at the lobby, at the marble and the chandeliers and the floral arrangement in the center, which had been changed from the winter arrangement to something that used more color, a recommendation from the events team for the spring season. At the guests beginning to filter in through the revolving door, some in expensive coats and some not, some with children and some alone. He stood there for a moment and let himself have it, the full weight and strangeness of being in a room his father had built, standing on a floor his father had laid, in a building that had come back to his family through the slowest, most grinding version of justice imaginable. And that was now, imperfectly and daily, and with a great deal of work still ahead, becoming something he could build on. He thought about his father in the chair by the window. He thought about the box on the top shelf. He thought about a 9-year-old girl named Maya from the West Side District who wanted to be a visual artist and whose scholarship application would be confirmed on Monday. Then he went to find Chloe, who had almost certainly already filled 2 pages of her sketchbook and was probably asking Sandra questions that Sandra hadn't prepared answers for. He walked through the lobby he owned, past the east corridor where it had all begun, and into the West Gallery where his daughter was standing in front of a large watercolor painting with her sketchbook open, her pencil moving, her whole body pitched slightly forward, the way it did when she was looking at something she couldn't quite believe was real. He stood back and watched her. He didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that the moment wasn't already saying for itself. Spring came to the city the way it always did. Not all at once, but in small concessions. A warmer afternoon between cold ones. The trees on Caldwell Avenue putting out the first tentative green along their branches. The light changing its angle, arriving earlier, staying longer, making the pale limestone facade of the Royal Crest Hotel look different at 7 in the morning than it had looked all winter. Landon noticed these things now in a way he hadn't before. He drove past the hotel most mornings on his way to meetings, and he'd developed the habit, unconscious at first, then deliberate, of looking at the building as he passed. Not with ownership pride exactly, more with the attentive familiarity of someone still learning to recognize something as theirs. He'd been the majority owner of the Royal Crest Hotel for 4 months. He still worked through the strangeness of that fact on a daily basis. The hardware store job he'd left in January, which had felt more significant in the doing of it than he'd expected. He'd given 3 weeks' notice, which his manager, a compact man named Deshawn, who'd known Landon for 4 years, had received with the particular combination of genuine happiness and mild personal inconvenience the good managers show when they lose reliable people. "Where are you going?" Deshawn had asked. Landon had thought about how to answer that. "I came into some property," he'd said finally. Deshawn had looked at him. What kind of property? A hotel? A long pause. What hotel? The Royal Crest. Deshaun had stared at him for what felt like 10 full seconds. Then he'd laughed. A real laugh, the kind that doesn't plan itself. Man, he'd said. Man. They'd shaken hands on the last day, and Deshaun had given him a card signed by the whole team, which Landon had put in the kitchen drawer where he kept things that mattered. He still missed the work sometimes, not the specific tasks, though there was something straightforward and satisfying about physical work with concrete outcomes, a thing fixed, a thing installed, a result you could point to at the end of a shift. He missed the simplicity of knowing exactly what the day required of him. The hotel was never like that. The hotel was layered and complicated, and every decision existed inside a web of other decisions, and some days he drove home at 7 in the evening feeling like he'd been in the water all day without ever finding the bottom. But he was learning. That was the honest thing he could say about those 4 months. He was learning faster than he'd expected, and the learning had its own momentum, and he'd found that the same careful attention he'd brought to other people's documents and other people's problems for years was, it turned out, genuinely useful when applied to something of his own. Touch. The apology came on a Tuesday morning in late March, not Victoria's corridor apology from December, that had been said and received and filed honestly on both sides. This was different. This was something she'd asked for specifically, through a brief message to his office that said only, "I'd like to speak with you and Chloe, if you're willing." Not about the hotel. Personally. He'd sat with the message for 2 days before he responded. He'd asked Chloe first, which felt right. He wasn't going to bring his daughter into a room with someone without her consent. And he wasn't going to make the decision for her about whether she wanted to hear what Victoria had to say. "She wants to apologize," he told Chloe. They were in the kitchen, a Saturday morning, Chloe at the table with cereal and her sketchbook, Landon standing at the counter with coffee. "To both of us?" "Yes." Chloe considered this. She was 10 now, had been 10 for 6 weeks, her birthday having arrived with the predictable force of something Landon had started preparing for in November. She'd had a small party, 5 friends, pizza at the apartment, and afterwards she'd told him it was the best birthday she'd had since she was 7, which he'd chosen to take as high praise. "Does she actually mean it?" Chloe asked. "Or does she have to say it because you're her boss now?" He looked at his daughter. "Why does that distinction matter to you?" "Because an apology where someone's afraid of you isn't actually an apology. It's just managing a situation." He stared at her for a moment. "Where did you learn that?" "I don't know. Is it true?" "Yes, it's true." "So does she actually mean it?" He thought about Victoria in the conference room in December, the thing working in her face that she hadn't been able to control quickly enough. He thought about her in his office in January. "I've been thinking about October more than I expected to." He thought about her at the February community event, showing up 45 minutes early in jeans instead of a blazer, helping Sandra move chairs, staying for the whole 4 hours, and talking to people with the slightly stiff effort of someone who was genuinely trying rather than performing. "I think she does," he said. Chloe turned her pencil end over end. "Okay," she said, "then we can hear it." Gemmed. They met at the hotel on a Thursday afternoon after school, in the small sitting room off the West Gallery. Not an office, not a conference room, a room with upholstered chairs and good light and the low sound of the gallery beyond the door. Landon had chosen it deliberately, neutral, comfortable. Not a room that belonged to either of them more than the other. Victoria was there when they arrived. She was standing near the window, not sitting, and she was in her own version of not quite formal, a blazer over a simple shirt, but a different posture than her office posture. Less held. She looked at Chloe when they came in. Chloe looked back at her with the specific directness of a 10-year-old who has decided to evaluate a situation on its merits and hasn't made up her mind yet. They sat. Victoria sat across from them. "Thank you for coming," Victoria said. She said it to both of them, but she was looking at Chloe. "Sure," Chloe said, which was the universal 10-year-old response to things that were happening that she wasn't sure about yet. Victoria was quiet for a moment. And in that moment, Landon could see the thing that the months of working with her had shown him, that she was not, underneath the precision and control, a person who found difficult conversations easy. She'd built the precision specifically because difficult conversations weren't easy. The composure was the management, not the absence of discomfort. "I want to tell you what I did," Victoria said to Chloe. "Not a version of it that softens it or makes me look better. What actually happened?" Chloe was watching her with those eyes, Rachel's eyes, clear and waiting. "You came to this hotel in October," Victoria said. "You and your dad. You were here for the children's exhibition. You'd been looking forward to it. And then there was an accident in the East Corridor. You knocked over a vase. And I came in, and I looked at your dad, and I made a decision about him before I knew anything about him. I decided, based on nothing except the way he looked and what I assumed about him, that he didn't belong here. And I had him escorted out." She paused. "With you watching, I had security walk the two of you out of this building in front of other guests." The room was very quiet. "I've tried to understand why I did that," Victoria said, "because I think understanding it is the only way to actually not do it again. And what I've come to is, I was operating by a standard that I'd absorbed without questioning, a standard that said certain people needed to justify their presence here and others didn't, that some people belonged in a place like this by default and others had to earn it somehow." She looked at her hands, then back at Chloe. "That standard is wrong. It's just wrong. And it was wrong before I knew who your dad was, before I knew anything about the history of this hotel. It was wrong in the corridor that morning, and you were 9 years old, and you had just had an accident, and you were scared, and I made it worse." Chloe had been very still through all of this. "I remember the vase," Chloe said. "I was trying to get the orange juice, and my elbow it went." She looked at Victoria. "I wasn't trying to break it." "I know," Victoria said. "And even if you had been, even if it was entirely intentional, the response would still have been wrong." She paused. "You asked your dad afterward whether poor people deserve less respect than everyone else." Chloe blinked. She looked at Landon. "He told me," Victoria said. "I asked." Chloe looked back at Victoria. "He said they don't." "He was right." "But you treated us like we did." "Yes," Victoria said, plainly, without deflection. "I did." Chloe was quiet for a moment. She had her sketchbook in her lap. She brought it everywhere. It was basically an extension of herself. And she turned it in her hands without opening it. "Why are you telling me this?" Chloe asked. "Because you deserve to hear it directly. Not just your dad. You. You're the one who asked the question. You're the one who had to leave." Victoria looked at her steadily. "And because I think if I don't say it plainly to you, the thing that happened in October stays in the air between us, and I don't want that." Chloe thought about this for a long moment. Then she said, "Are you different now? Or are you just saying you're different?" Landon closed his eyes briefly. 10 years old. Victoria didn't flinch. "I'm working on being different," she said. "I think 'I'm different now' is too clean. I've had a long time of thinking a certain way. You don't undo that completely in a few months. What I can tell you is that I think about it now. I catch myself. When I'm in a situation where I'm making a fast judgment about someone, I catch myself in a way I didn't before. That's not the same as being fixed, but it's real." Chloe looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that children give when they're doing their actual assessment, unfiltered. "Okay," Chloe said finally. "Okay, you accept the apology?" Landon asked. "Okay, I believe she means it," Chloe said. "That's the first part. The accepting is the second part." She looked at Victoria. "I'm still thinking about the second part." Victoria looked at her with something that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the neighborhood of one. "That's fair," she said. "Take whatever time you need." They walked out through the West Gallery afterward, Landon and Chloe, past the Adara Voss watercolors that Chloe had now seen 4 times and still stopped in front of each visit. Chloe stopped in front of her favorite, the largest one, a wide horizontal piece that used blues and greens in a way that wasn't realistic but was somehow exactly true to the feeling of moving water. She stood there for a moment, sketchbook under her arm. "Dad?" "Yeah." "She's going to keep trying. I can tell." "I think so too. That matters more than whether she's already perfect at it." He looked at his daughter, this person he'd been raising alone for 6 years, This person who'd come out of the combination of him and Rachel with something that was neither of them exactly, but was unmistakably shaped by both. Rachel's clarity, his stubbornness, and something all her own that he'd been watching develop since she was old enough to hold a pencil. "When did you get so wise?" he said. She looked at him like the question was beneath her. "I've always been wise," she said. "You just weren't paying attention." What? The spring exhibition ran through April. The scholarship cohort, all 14 children, had their tour in the third week of March, a Saturday morning, 2 hours through the hotel's spaces, with Sandra leading and Victoria appearing midway through, not as an executive presence, but simply as a person who knew the building and could answer questions. The kids were loud and curious, and one of them, a 12-year-old boy who wanted to be an architect, asked questions about the structural engineering of the ballroom ceiling that nobody on the staff could fully answer, and that required a follow-up email to the original construction records. Maya, the 9-year-old from the West Side district, stood in front of the Adara Voss painting for so long that Sandra had to come back for her. She had a sketchbook, too. She was copying the color patterns, her tongue between her teeth, her whole body concentrated on the page. Landon watched this from the gallery entrance, where he'd come down to observe the tour without interrupting it, and felt something that he couldn't have named cleanly, but that sat in him warm and solid. The scholarship program's first formal session started in April. 4 Saturdays, workshops in visual art and creative writing and hospitality fundamentals for the older kids, conducted in the hotel's event spaces by working professionals. Landon attended the first one without announcing himself, sitting in the back of the room while a graphic designer named Lena walked 14 children through the basics of composition. He sat there for 90 minutes and watched their faces, the concentration, the frustration when something didn't work, the specific bright expression that moved across a child's face when something clicked into place. He thought about his father, who had built this room. He thought about what it would have meant to his father to see this room used this way. He didn't let himself stay in that thought too long, because there was work to do, and the thought had a weight to it that could become indulgent if he wasn't careful. But he let himself have it for the length of time it took to have it honestly, and then he stood up and went back to his office. The harder things didn't resolve cleanly. That was the reality that nobody prepared you for. Not the lawyers, not the people who knew the legal outcome in advance, not the cultural narrative that said reclaiming something taken from you would feel like completion. The ownership was real. The work it required was real. And underneath both of those was a layer of things that didn't close just because circumstances had changed. He still had nights where he lay awake and ran through his father's timeline, the years of his father trying to fight it and running out of resources, the silence of the chair by the window, the box going onto the shelf and staying there, the waste of it, the specific personal grief of a wrong that had been done to someone who deserved better and who had spent his remaining years managing the knowledge of that wrong with a dignity that Landon understood more clearly now than he had at 25. He still sometimes drove past the hotel on a morning and felt the strangeness of it. Not pride, not triumph, just strangeness. The gap between where he'd been standing in October and where he was standing now was so large and had closed so fast that his sense of his own life hadn't fully caught up with the facts of it. He talked to Gerald about this one evening in March, sitting at Gerald's kitchen table with the same kind of late coffee they'd had the night they went through the box together. He tried to explain the thing he couldn't quite resolve, the victory that didn't feel entirely like a victory because his father wasn't there to see it. Gerald listened without interrupting. He was good at that, better than most people Landon knew. "You think he'd be satisfied?" Gerald said when Landon had finished. Landon thought about it honestly. "I think he'd tell me to stop overthinking it and run the hotel well." "That sounds right." "It doesn't answer the other thing, though." "No," Gerald agreed. "It doesn't." He wrapped his hands around his coffee mug. "Some things don't answer. They just become part of the story." Landon was quiet for a moment. "He put everything in that box, and he waited," Landon said. "I don't know if he believed it would matter eventually. I don't know if he just couldn't bear to throw it away." "Maybe it doesn't matter which one it was," Gerald said. "Either way, he kept it. And either way, you found it." That was the kind of answer Gerald gave. Not comforting exactly, but honest. And honest was what Landon actually needed from the people in his life. He'd never had much patience for the version of comfort that required the world to be tidier than it was. "Yeah," Landon said. They sat at the table for a while longer, in the easy silence of people who had been through something real together. In April, Victoria asked to be involved in the community event planning. Not to oversee it, but she was specific about that. She'd been attending the monthly event since February, first as a helper with setup, then gradually becoming part of the actual programming. She'd organized a panel discussion in March featuring 3 women who'd built careers in hospitality from non-traditional backgrounds. She'd been in the room for the whole thing, not at the front, but in the audience, asking questions alongside people who had never set foot in the Royal Crest Hotel before those monthly Saturdays. What she was asking now was whether she could take on a more formal coordinating role. "I want to be responsible for it," she told Landon. "Not just supporting it. I want it to be part of my actual job description." He looked at her across his desk. "Why?" She seemed to have expected the question. "Because it's the part of this work that I find myself thinking about when I'm not here. The other things, occupancy rates, revenue per available room, the operational metrics, those are the things I'm good at. I've always been good at them. They don't require me to change anything." She paused. "This does. And I think I need that. Professionally, but also—" She stopped, which was unusual for her. "Also personally," he said. "Yes." He thought about what she'd said to Chloe. "I catch myself." He thought about Jean's at the community event setup 45 minutes early. He thought about the panel discussion in March, as the quality of her listening. "Add it to your role, Ma," he said. "Work out the logistics with Sandra so the responsibilities are clear. And I want a quarterly report on outcomes, not metrics, actual outcomes. What changed for the people who came through? Stories, not numbers." She looked at him. "Stories are harder to measure." "That's why I want them," he said. "Anyone can manage numbers. Numbers don't tell you whether something actually mattered." Well, she wrote it down. She nodded. "There's something else," she said. "Oh, go ahead." "The entrance staff training. Briggs has been running it, and it's going well, but I think it needs something it doesn't have yet." She looked at him. "I think it needs someone to tell them what it actually feels like to be on the wrong end of that judgment. Not a policy explanation. A person." He understood where she was going. "You're asking me to talk to them," he said. "I'm asking if you'd be willing to." He considered this. He'd thought about it before. He had thought about it and moved on to other things because there was always something more immediately pressing. But Victoria was right. A policy change was a policy change. A person in a room telling people what it had felt like to be walked out of this building with his daughter was something different. "Set it up," he said. Ding. He spoke to the full security and front-of-house staff on a Thursday morning in late April. Briggs had arranged the room, the lower-level meeting space, all 23 people seated, the kind of attendance that told him they'd been told this mattered. Landon stood at the front of the room. He didn't have notes. He told them about October. He told it plainly. The parking lot 2 blocks away, the ironed shirt, the tin of polish, Chloe's list with the asterisks, the corridor, the broken vase, the security guards moving into position. He described his daughter's face when she understood what was happening. He described her question on the sidewalk afterward, the one she'd asked in the particular voice of a child trying to make logical sense of something that refused to be logical. He didn't dramatize it. He didn't modulate his voice for effect. He just told it. The room was very quiet. "I'm not telling you this to make you feel bad," he said. "I'm telling you because I think the policy change is only useful if you understand what the policy was actually doing to real people. Every person who was walked out of this building because someone decided they didn't look right, they had a version of that sidewalk conversation, with their kid, with themselves, with whoever they went home to." He paused. This hotel was built to be a place where people came in and felt something, welcome, safe, valued. That's the job. Not the marble floors, not the chandeliers, the feeling people carry when they leave. He looked around the room. They were listening, really listening, not the polite performance of listening. "You have real judgment calls to make every day," he said. "I'm not pretending otherwise, but the default, the starting point, has to be dignity, not scrutiny, not a requirement to prove belonging." He looked at Briggs, who was sitting in the second row with his large hands folded on his knees, his face attentive. "That's the standard. Dignity first." Briggs nodded once, slow and deliberate. Questions? Landon said. A young woman near the back, one of the front-of-house staff, he thought her name was Renata, raised her hand. What do we do when guests complain? When one guest tells us another guest doesn't... She paused, choosing words. Doesn't fit? You tell them that every guest of the Royal Crest Hotel is treated with the same respect, and that this is the policy of ownership. And if they have a problem with that, you escalate to management. He paused. And if I'm in the building, you escalate to me. Another hand, a man near the door. Has anything like what happened to you here again, since you took ownership? Landon thought about it. Not to me, but it may have happened to someone else who doesn't own the hotel. That's the point. He looked around the room. The goal isn't for this to not happen to me. The goal is for it to not happen to anyone. The room held what he'd said for a moment. Then Briggs said, All right, thank you, Mr. Pierce. He said it simply, directly, the way Briggs said everything. Thank you for listening, Landon said. Chloe gave Victoria the second part of her answer on a Saturday in early May. She did it in the middle of the scholarship cohort session, which she'd started attending as a junior participant. She was younger than the program's target age, but Landon had bent the rule on the grounds that it was his rule to bend, and Sandra had approved on the grounds that Chloe already drew better than half the people in the room. Victoria was there, helping to facilitate. She and Chloe had been in the same spaces several times by this point, had exchanged words over artwork, over the logistics of setup, the small, ordinary exchanges of people who share a space regularly and have reached a kind of functional familiarity. Chloe came up to Victoria between sessions while the other kids were on a break, and Victoria was reviewing materials on a clipboard. She stood in front of her and waited until Victoria looked up. I thought about it, Chloe said. Victoria lowered the clipboard. I accept it, Chloe said. The apology. Victoria looked at her for a moment. Something moved in her face. Something real, unmanaged. Thank you, Victoria said. I need to tell you why, Chloe said, which Victoria hadn't expected from her expression. Because I think reasons matter. Okay, Victoria said. I accept it because you told me the truth about what you did. You didn't make it smaller or blame it on something else. You just said what you did and why it was wrong. Chloe paused. And because you've been showing up here every month and actually doing the work instead of just talking about it. I've been watching. Victoria made a sound that might have been a short, involuntary exhale of something. I've been watching you watch, Victoria said quietly. I know, Chloe said. I wanted you to know I was watching. She hitched her backpack up on her shoulder. Okay, that's all. She went back to her table, sat down, opened her sketchbook, and resumed drawing as if the conversation had been a minor administrative matter. Landon, who had been standing near the door and had watched the whole exchange without meaning to, turned and went into the corridor and stood there for a moment with his hand on the wall. He thought about his father, who had built this building and lost it, and spent years documenting the theft and then gotten sick, and sat in a chair by a window and never seen the end of the story. He thought about the box on the top shelf, the yellowed tape on the lid. Landon, in block letters. His father had known, in some part of him, that the box was for Landon, that the story wasn't over, that he was leaving something that would matter to someone who would eventually be ready to use it. Maybe he'd believed it. Maybe he'd just hoped. Landon thought about that often. The difference between belief and hope, the way they could look identical from the outside and only be distinguishable from inside the person carrying them. He'd carried the box for 6 years without opening it. He'd needed the right moment. Or, more honestly, he'd needed his daughter to ask a question on a sidewalk that he couldn't answer, which was not the same as a right moment, but was the thing that had worked. That was the part that nobody's story of justice captured cleanly. The part about timing and readiness and the specific friction between knowing a thing should be done and having the energy to do it. His father had run out of energy. Landon had almost let himself run out too, in the quiet accumulation of years where survival was the constant and everything else got deferred. What had saved him from that deferral was a 9-year-old girl who had spent 4 months saving money in a coffee tin and made a list with asterisks and asked the most honest question he'd ever been asked. He thought about that, about what it meant to be saved from your own exhaustion by someone who needed you to be more than exhausted. He thought about the fact that he'd been raising her alone for 6 years, and he'd spent those years believing, on the harder days, that she needed him more than he needed her, that he was the one doing the caring. And the reality was more complicated than that. The reality was that they'd been carrying each other the whole time, which was the thing you couldn't fully see until you were standing in a corridor outside a room where your 10-year-old daughter was telling a grown woman that she forgave her because the woman had been honest and had done the work. May became June. The hotel moved into its summer rhythm. Higher occupancy, a different demographic in the lobby on weekends, children more visible in the spaces as families came through on vacation. The community events expanded to twice monthly in June and July, a decision Landon had approved at Victoria's recommendation, which Sandra had supported on the grounds that demand had consistently outpaced capacity at the once-monthly events. The employee benefits restructuring was finalized in May. It had taken longer than he'd hoped and involved 3 rounds of negotiation with department managers and a significant amount of back and forth with the hotel's financial team about sustainability. The outcome was not everything he'd initially proposed. A few elements had been scaled back, timelines extended. But the core changes were real. Wage floors increased, healthcare contributions restructured. The specific daily indignities of hourly service work addressed in concrete ways that showed up in paychecks and schedules. He got a card from the housekeeping department on the day the new structure took effect. It was a standard card, the kind with a generic floral border, signed by 11 people. One of them had written, in small, careful handwriting below her signature, "My daughter can get her braces now." He put it in the drawer with Deshawn's card. Gerald came to the hotel a second time in June, this time for dinner in the main dining room, Landon's treat, which Gerald tried to decline and then accepted with the grace of someone who understood that this was a gesture that mattered to both of them. They sat at a table by the window, the city visible through the glass, and ate a meal that was too good and too expensive and that Gerald consumed with the careful appreciation of someone who knew what things cost and therefore knew what they were worth. "Your father sat in here once," Gerald said toward the end of the meal. "Did I ever tell you that?" Landon looked at him. "No. Before I knew you. I was working downtown, must have been, 25 years ago. I came in here for something, a closing dinner for a transaction I'd been involved in. I didn't know Robert Pierce, but I looked him up afterward, after you and I started talking, and I found a photograph of the opening of this hotel, and he was standing in this room." Gerald looked out the window. He looked like a man who had made something he was proud of. He was. And now his son is sitting in the same room. Gerald looked at him. "I just wanted to say that out loud to someone." Landon looked at the window, at the city. "I'm glad you did," he said. He took Chloe to the ballroom one evening in June, after the hotel had closed to guests for the night, when the cleaners had finished and the space was empty and quiet and lit only by the ambient light from the corridor and the city through the tall windows. It was the ballroom she'd dreamed about visiting, the room that appeared in the sketch on her corkboard 4 separate times in 4 separate versions that she'd drawn from imagination before she'd ever stepped inside it. She walked in and stopped. The room was large, genuinely large, not just lobby large, but the kind of large that reorganized your sense of scale. The ceiling was high and ornate, the floors a wide plank wood worn beautifully smooth by decades of use. The windows along the east wall let in the ambient light of the city, which at this hour was a particular kind of illumination, not dark, not light, something in between that made the room look like it was holding its breath. Chloe stood in the center of the floor. She was 10 years old, in her school clothes, with her backpack on and her sketchbook inside it, and she stood in the middle of the ballroom her grandfather had built and looked up at the ceiling. "It's bigger than I drew it," she said. "Most things are. I got the proportions wrong." "You'd never seen it." She turned in a slow circle, looking at everything. The molding along the upper walls, the chandeliers unlit, their crystals catching the ambient light in points, the curve of the corridor entrance across the room. "He built this," she said. Not a question, just the act of making it real by saying it out loud. "He did. And then he lost it." "Yes. And we got it back." Yes. She stood still in the center of the floor. She was quiet for a moment that stretched longer than usual, and he let it stretch. I want to draw it for real now, she said, now that I've seen it. Okay. She took off her backpack, sat down cross-legged on the ballroom floor, and opened her sketchbook. She found a pencil. She looked at the room for a long moment, the way she looked at things before she drew them, the total attention of someone making the image in her mind before committing it to the page. Then she started drawing. Landon sat on the floor beside her. He wasn't sure why he sat down instead of standing. It wasn't something he'd planned. He just sat, and the ballroom was quiet around them, and Chloe drew, and the city moved outside the windows in its ordinary, endless way. He thought about the things he'd learned in the past 8 months, not the legal things. Those were specific and finite, and had been learned and applied and would continue to be applied. He meant the other things, the things you couldn't learn from a document or a briefing or a conversation with a lawyer. He'd learned that dignity was not a condition you arrived at once and maintained without effort. It was a practice, daily, imperfect, requiring constant attention. The same way his father's careful notes in the box had been a practice. The same way Briggs's recalibrated judgment at the entrance was a practice. The same way Victoria Hale showing up early to move chairs was a practice. He'd learned that revenge and reclamation were not the same thing, and that the difference between them was not softness or forgiveness or any of the words that sounded passive. The difference was in what you were building toward. Revenge was a destination. Reclamation was a foundation. You could stand on a foundation and build. You couldn't build on revenge. You could only stand on it until it finished being satisfying, which didn't take as long as anyone expected. He'd learned that his daughter was going to be fine. More than fine. She was going to be the kind of person who accepted apologies when they were genuine and withheld them when they weren't, who watched people to see if their actions matched their words, who sat on ballroom floors and drew from life, now that she'd seen the thing for real. He'd been afraid for her in ways he hadn't fully admitted to himself, afraid that October had left something in her that wouldn't resolve, some early lesson about the world being a place that sorted people by their worth and found some of them lacking. He'd wanted to protect her from that lesson. He hadn't been able to. But what she'd done with the lesson was not what he'd feared. She hadn't become hard. She hadn't become cynical. She'd become more precise, more careful about distinguishing between what was true and what people performed, more willing to ask the direct question, more patient about waiting for the answer, which was not protection from the world's difficulty. But it was something better than protection. It was equipment. He thought about what he wanted the Royal Crest Hotel to be, going forward. He'd set it in pieces in various rooms, to the management team, to the staff, to the scholarship cohort. What he hadn't said, because it was the kind of thing that sounded grandiose when you said it in a meeting, but was true nonetheless, was this. He wanted it to be a place where the second question a person asked, after "Can I come in?" was never "Am I welcome here?" He wanted the welcome to be the given, and everything else to be built on top of that. His father had built a beautiful building. Landon wanted to make it a generous one. He wasn't finished. He was not close to finished. There were 100 things still broken or half-built or not yet started. The supplier contract was still unresolved. The East Wing needed a new maintenance plan. The scholarship program's second cohort was forming, and he hadn't sorted out the curriculum for the spring session. Victoria and Sandra were in a disagreement about the third community events programming that had been sitting in his inbox for 3 days waiting for him to weigh in. And in the apartment on the street 2 blocks from where he'd parked the Civic in October, there was a coffee tin on the second shelf of the kitchen cabinet that still had $40 in it from the secret fund, which he'd never thought about until this moment, and which made him smile in the empty ballroom in a way that he was grateful no one was there to see. $40. After everything, still sitting there, he'd have to figure out what to do with it. Chloe was still drawing. Her pencil moved with that particular focused speed she had when the image was clear to her, when she'd looked long enough that the thing existed fully in her mind before it existed on the page. He leaned slightly to see what she was drawing, the room, the ceiling, the windows with the city light coming through, and in the center of the floor 2 figures sitting together, small but recognizable, him and her. He looked at the drawing for a moment, then back at the room, the real room, The ballroom his father had built on Caldwell Avenue, and that had been taken and had come back, and that was, in this specific moment on a Tuesday evening in June, quiet and lit by the city and containing exactly two people. "Hey, Chloe," he said. Your grandfather would have liked you." She didn't look up from the sketchbook, but he saw the thing that happened at the corner of her mouth, the same small thing he'd seen months ago when he'd told her she was going to see the exhibition. "I know," she said. She kept drawing. He stayed where he was. The city moved outside the windows, and the chandeliers caught the light in their small, cold points, and the room held everything in it, the history and the loss and the long work of getting here and the longer work still ahead, with the particular patience of a building that had been standing for 24 years and intended to stand for many more. It was enough. It was, for now, exactly enough.